Fred Kelly here, your nerd sidekick, and today I'm going to build a computer out of the parts that you see assembled here. This is what I call the slow and easy build, and I mean this for anybody who has never built a computer before. This is for you. I'm going to try to take my time and really show you good close-ups of what I'm doing so you understand it. I'll show you everything you need to build your own computer, including parts selection, installing the CPU and RAM, installing a CPU cooler, installing the motherboard, installing a power supply and attaching power cables, connecting pesky case cables, installing and connecting fans and RGB lights, installing a GPU, cable management, installing Windows and drivers, and so much more. With this video guide, anyone can build their first computer. So let's get started. One of the first things that a lot of people want to know is what parts to buy. And this isn't so much about the parts as it is about just the actual physical assembly of those parts. However, I do want to give you a little bit of background about the parts that I'm using, and maybe that'll help you pick some of the parts that you need. So let's talk about the first thing you need is that's a case, and you can spend $50 on a case or you can spend $250 on a case. This one was $105, and it's just kind of a good all-around case. We'll get that out here in just a minute. And then let's talk about the processor, which is in this case, I'm using an Intel processor. And so if you know anything about processors, you basically have two choices. There's AMD and there's Intel, and so that will make some decisions for you about other parts that you buy once you pick your processor. We'll talk about that in just a second. Let's look at the processor I got here, and so this is the i7. This is the i7-13700K. A couple things about that. The 13 here tells you this is a 13th gen processor, so this is not the most recent processor. They're actually Intel's on the 14th gen processor as of the time of making this video, but I didn't need a super high end, the most recent processor. And so one of the things that you can do to save money is you can get something that's maybe not the absolute top of the line. I can guarantee for most people's needs, you don't need top of the line. You can save a lot of money just by buying something that is adequate, and in this case, this is adequate for what I'm doing. And the point of this PC is that I needed one that I could use in future videos I make for this channel and for you, for my viewers. I wanted to have something that I could use in videos and maybe mess it up and it wouldn't impact a computer I actually use in my daily life. So that's what this is going to be used for. So I didn't need a top-of-the-line computer that gives me absolutely the highest performance necessary. Let's talk about the processor just a little more. So the K here tells you that this is an unlocked processor. What does that mean? This is a processor that you can actually make some changes to the settings for that processor. You can do overclocking and make your processor run just a little faster. A lot of gamers like to do that, but I'm not going to be doing that for this particular build. So that's the processor. Now let's talk about the motherboard. So this is the motherboard, and basically you're going to install everything onto the motherboard, and so this processor will go into that little spot right there, for example. So that brings me to a point I wanted to mention. I talked about it earlier, the difference between the processor that you're using. So Intel versus AMD, your two choices basically in the PC world today. And that will determine the motherboard that you are going to purchase, because a motherboard that supports an Intel processor does not support an AMD processor. This specific socket here will change depending on whether the processor is AMD or Intel. So if you're looking at stats for a processor, for example, and you like that processor, well, then you're going to have to find a motherboard that works for that particular type of processor. One of the most important things to consider when purchasing your motherboard is what version of PCI Express the board supports. You can see this board here supports PCI Express 5.0. What is PCI Express? That's the Peripheral Component Interconnect Express, which is a mouthful, but basically it is a standard that was created by a number of companies, and the first version was released back in 2003. And every time a new version of that is released, for the most part, it means that the speed at which the motherboard can talk to components installed onto that motherboard doubles. So what that means is you want to have the highest version of PCI Express that you can afford or that is available. And so currently PCI Express 6 has actually been released, but there aren't really any boards that are supporting that right now. So you have to think in terms of trying to get the best board possible so that you future-proof your computer. And so this is an example where I have a board that supports PCIe 5. However, I could install components that, let's say they work at PCI Express 3. Or in the case of my solid state drive, so that's what this is right here. This is the NVMe drive from Samsung that I got for this particular build. And this component actually only works at PCI Express 4.0. And so one of the benefits of using components that aren't necessarily equal to the speed of your motherboard is that they're usually cheaper. You can get PCI Express 5 solid state drives right now. However, they're almost double the cost of this particular 4.0 drive. So think about that in terms of future-proofing your computer by having a motherboard that will support the highest level possible of PCI Express. In the case of this particular board, while it does support PCI Express 5, there's actually only a single expansion port that supports that standard, and that is the port normally used to install a graphics card. The M.2 ports or slots that you would normally install a solid-state drive like this into, those only support the PCI Express 4 standard. So you just need to make sure when you are considering a particular motherboard, you check the specs, understand what the different ports are and what versions of PCI Express they support. So I've shown you this, that this is the solid state drive that will go in this computer. Of course, you could choose to put in a regular old hard drive, the old style drives. They're much cheaper based on the amount of space versus the cost for that space. Much cheaper than this type of drive, but these are much faster. And for most people, unless you're dealing with very large files, just a 2 terabyte drive like this should be enough. And so keep that in mind as you build your computer. These are very simple to install, and you'll see that as we get into this. So let's talk about the next thing, which is the RAM. So what is RAM? This is random access memory. I'm installing 2 sticks, 16 gigabytes each. So these 2 sticks together equal 32 gigabytes of RAM. And RAM has gotten relatively inexpensive. So you can build a computer with 16 gigabytes and that will be just fine for the vast majority of people. Even gaming computers, 16 gigs of RAM should be just fine. But RAM has become so cheap now. This was only about $100 for 2 sticks here to equal 32 gigabytes that I went ahead and just thought I would future-proof this computer. So what does RAM do? Well, so I store my programs. When I install programs, they get stored on here, or my data gets stored on here, and that's for long-term storage. And as I run a program, so let's say I double-click on the icon to run Microsoft Word. When I do that, the data, all the instructions, the program for that Microsoft Word actually get transferred onto the RAM, and then the computer can access the RAM at a much higher rate of speed, work with that program, work with the data, and make your computer work. So programs and data are stored here long term, but temporarily while you're using your computer, the RAM is where that actually goes. And when you turn your computer off, because this is volatile, that means that as soon as you turn your computer off, the data that's stored on the RAM is disappeared, is erased, and you can't access that again. So that's why we have long-term storage like this. All right, so that's the basic components. You can see, very simple, not many components here. So again, like I said, you can do this. All right, so let's talk about the next thing, which is a cooler. And why do you need a cooler? Well, these CPUs, the central processing unit of your computer, can get very hot, and especially if you're doing things like gaming or rendering video or something like that, you can find that this processor can get very hot and it needs to be cooled. And so there are a number of different ways to cool a CPU. And this is just one of many types of coolers. This particular one has a fan, and it has these little tubes that basically sit on top of the CPU, and it wicks the heat away from the CPU, and then the fan blows that outside the back of this case, and that helps to get the heat out of the system. So think of that like a radiator on your car. That's basically what a cooler does. And of course, you can also use water cooling to cool your PC, but that gets into a different realm, and I don't need that. That's really for gaming and that sort of thing. If you want to do some really high-end stuff, you can certainly cool your PC that way. A lot of times the less expensive CPUs actually come with a cooler, but they're usually very small. They just sit right there on top of the CPU, and I think they're a little noisy sometimes, and so I prefer to have a cooler like this because the fan size is bigger, and that allows the cooling to be pretty much silent. So something like this, I think this was about $55, and they're fans and coolers that can run anywhere from $25 up to a couple of $100. So let's talk about the final thing that's sitting here, which is this power supply. And so before I get into that though, I want to ask a question for anybody here who's built a computer before, or if you just have started the process and maybe you've looked at parts. Is there something missing? Well, if you said a graphics card, you are correct. And so in all cases, you don't have to have a graphics card. And I don't need a graphics card for this particular build, although at some point in the future I may put one in. And I will demonstrate how to install a graphics card later in the video. The reason I don't need a graphics card is because this CPU has what's called an iGPU, or Integrated Graphics Processing Unit. And together, along with this motherboard, the CPU can provide graphical output. So I can plug in a monitor into the back of this motherboard, and together with the CPU, I'll be able to work on my computer just fine. Now, if you want to play games at a very high frame rate, for example, or at a very high resolution, yes, you probably want to have a graphics card. But graphics cards are expensive. You can spend hundreds, even a couple of $1,000s on a graphics card, and I just didn't need to do that for this particular build. So back to the power supply. So why did I tell you all that? Well, this power supply is, for this particular set of parts, without that graphics card, this is an overkill power supply. It has way more, it can provide way more power to this PC than it needs, but I wanted to future-proof the build once again, so I bought a power supply that can support a graphics card in the future. So there are power supply calculators online you can look up and enter the components that you're planning to use in your computer, and it will tell you the amount of power that you need and the size of the power supply that you're going to need for your particular PC. So that's the grand tour of the parts I'm going to be using, and let's start putting this thing together. I'm almost ready to begin assembly, but let's talk about some of the tools that you might want to have on hand. First thing I got to have is a light. This is a real neat little light here, very flexible. You can stand it up, position the light where you need it. Very bright light, and it actually has several different settings. It even has a light that I can point at the very end of this, so that's very helpful. And then this is a set of tools specifically made for working on computers and other electronics. A whole bunch of different bits that you can use to work with different size screws, different types of screws, and it even has pieces that let you take things apart if you were working on other electronics like phones or tablets, and then the screwdriver itself. And so that's a great little kit. And then I have a screwdriver here that is ratcheting and goes in two different directions, so it's very helpful. And then I got a little set of cutting pliers for cable management if I need that, and some needle nose pliers. And then I have this set of magnetic little trays or bins, and these are very hard to separate. You can see they're magnetic, but the value in that is that you can put your screws as you're working with different size screws, and they are not going to go anywhere. So that's helpful when you're either building or taking something apart. So that's the tools I'll be using. You can get links to these in the description below. Let's start building. First, we're going to start building with the motherboard. We're going to open that up. So here's the motherboard. You can see what is in here. We have the motherboard itself inside this anti-static bag. Looks like here we have an antenna for the Wi-Fi. Pull the motherboard out. What remains is the instruction booklet. It tells you a lot of things about your motherboard. Do not lose this because this is going to have some important information that you may not need today, but in the future it will be very helpful. This is a little shield that we'll install into our case, and a couple of looks like some screws here, and a single cable that we can use to connect a solid state drive. So don't have as many cables as we used to get with motherboards, because things have gotten a lot simpler in terms of the way things are connected. I would recommend just leaving most of this stuff inside unless you think you're going to need it right away. It's a good place to just keep it stored. And so close this. And so one of the things that's a really good practice, real simple way to just sort of give yourself a place to work, is to take your motherboard out of the anti-static bag. Place that away, out of your way, and you could just set your motherboard right there on top of your box. Sort of a cushiony way, safe place to work, and it'll give you a little platform that sits up and makes it easy to work on your motherboard. So let's talk about where the CPU is going. So this is the socket that the CPU will go into, and in this case it's an LGA 1700 socket, and that basically tells you some things about the CPU that we're going to install. So the Intel and AMD make their CPUs, and they change over the years, and so as they change, the motherboard manufacturers have to respond to that, and they have to build into their motherboard a socket that is meant specifically to work with a certain generation or generations of CPUs. And so again, this is the LGA 1700. That means there's 1700 pins on the socket. So you'll see those pins in just a minute. And so let's talk about the socket itself now. A couple of things to point out. One of the things is there's a plastic piece on this right now, and that's there to protect the pins that I mentioned on the inside, and that'll come off in just a minute. The next thing is that if you look in the corner here, it's hard to see, but there is a little triangular shape, and so that helps us orient the CPU in the right way. There's one way only that it's going to fit into the socket, and that helps you to know that we're going to match that triangle up with a triangle that's printed on the CPU itself. Okay, so how do we get this off? How do we open this up? Well, there is along here is a little hook here, sort of like a shepherd's hook, and I'm just going to push down on that and release it from this little metal piece, and that will just on its own, it's going to spring up, and then you can set it to the side like that. And then we need to lift this part up, so you can just lift it up there. And now you can see the inside, the 1700 pins that are a part of this socket are all in here, and we're going to connect that to the CPU in just a minute. A couple of things I want to point out about the socket itself. There are some little keys here. There's 4 of these little keys, and that will help us to align the CPU properly so that it can only go in one way. And also just point out, don't get anything in this, keep it clean, don't touch it. And so let me get my CPU now. Got that right here, and so let's open that up. All right, so every manufacturer is slightly different, even from one generation to the next. The way they package these, they're slightly different. But in my case, you can see I've got a little, came in this little piece of plastic, protective plastic. So let me open that up. And you'll see I just want to grab this by the sides. I don't want to touch it on the top. I don't want to get any oils on that because that could impact the cooling later on. On the bottom of the CPU, you can see here all of the contacts that will be touching the various pins on the socket. And so now let's take a look at the top of the CPU. And I just want to point out on this corner here are the 2 triangular shapes. And then I'll show you a picture here just so you can see it a little clearer. There's the triangles, and then on the other 3 corners are just little dots. And so what we're going to do is we're going to line up the little keys that I showed you earlier with the indentations on the sides of the CPU. You can see those here. Now I'm just going to very gently, very carefully drop that into the socket. And you can see that the keys, the 4 keys, match up with the indentations on the side of the CPU. One other thing to point out, on the 3 corners here, these are all squared off. But on this corner, it's actually just cuts very slightly, you can see. So again, that tells you that that's the corner that matches up with that triangle. Now we need to just close the cover. You can grab this and push it down. And you do need to push it down. And when you do that, you'll notice that the P&P cap here, that's what this is called, popped off. And you do want to save this. This is important if you ever have a warranty return. The manufacturer will likely require you to have this on the motherboard. So save that. And so now we need to make sure that this little hook here is going to catch on the tabs. And what that does is it allows us to then push the shepherd's hook down and push that back underneath that little metal pin. And we have successfully installed the CPU. And not much to it. It's took me longer to tell you how to do it than it will ever take you to install one. But I wanted to make sure you understood what to look for. The next thing to install is the RAM. I've got my 2 sticks of RAM here. Let me go ahead and take those out real quick. So what do I do with these? Well, let's talk about a couple of things. Let me turn the motherboard around here so you can see this a little more clearly. So in this motherboard, there are 4 slots where we could potentially put RAM. Your motherboard may have 2 slots, it may have 4, or it could even have more than that on a really high-end machine. And so there's a couple of things we have to think about. Number one is the orientation of the stick as it goes into one of these slots. There's only one direction that's right, and so you need to make sure that you get that correct. Does it go this way or does it go this way? Every kind of RAM is slightly different, and it's on purpose so that you can't accidentally put the wrong type of RAM into your motherboard. This motherboard works with DDR5 RAM, and that's typical, the kind of RAM that you see these days, either DDR4 or 5. You'll know right away if your RAM doesn't fit, but you also need to know is which direction is it going to go into the motherboard. This is meant to go in only one way. So if you look at the slots themselves, you can see that the slot here has a little notch here where that will determine the direction the stick needs to go in. This little notch here is not right in the center. The easy way to tell if this is going to fit is you just put your RAM stick down next to the slot, and you can see I've got the RAM stick is lined up here on the left side, and you can see the notch does not quite match up with the little notch in the slot itself. If I turn this over, and again I'll line this up over here on the left side just to make sure that that's in the right place. And you can see that notch, the 2 notches there seem to line up a little better. The next thing to think about is which slot or slots you will insert your RAM into, and that actually does matter. In fact, if you look in the booklet that came with your motherboard, there is probably something that will tell you that specifically. There's some standards that sort of have developed over the years, but let's take a look at this. This has a little diagram that shows you specifically if you have 1 stick of RAM, 2 or 4, which slots is this going to go into. And if you look at this motherboard itself, this manufacturer actually prints a little guide for you to show you which sticks are to go in first. It actually says first right there. And so it's telling us that I need to put 2 sticks are going to go first into this gray slot here and here. So let's actually install the RAM, and you need to look at the slots that you have on your motherboard. These little tabs here will push down, and you may have tabs on either side, on both sides. In this case, on my motherboard, these do not move. So I only have to push down tabs on these 2 sides here. So now I'm ready to actually insert a stick of RAM, and so let's just bring that down, push it straight down into the slot. Make sure your tabs are open. On both sides, just insert with even force, and it may take a little more force than you're comfortable with, but you notice that little tab popped up, and now it is locked in. That stick of RAM is not going to go anywhere. And so now I can put the second stick in, and just make sure that I have the orientation correct. Bring that down into the slot, and again pushing on both sides, and there it just popped right in. We have our sticks of RAM installed. Let's move to the next step. Next, it's time to install the solid state drive, the NVMe M.2 drive. And on this particular board, there are 3 places. So you got one here under this heatsink, and then you have another one here, and finally the third one is here. You've got 3 choices there where you could install that. Typically, you want to put it here on this one first. It's usually a little bit faster. So this is my NVMe solid state drive, and so the first thing I need to do to get that installed is I actually need to remove the heatsink, and so I'm just going to unscrew that. If you look at the underside of this heatsink, this has a thermal pad here with a little covering over the sticky part of it, and so you always need to make sure you remove that before you actually install the drive. So I'm going to pull that off, set that aside. This is going to touch the solid state drive and provide a better connection to the heatsink. And so now, just to install the solid state drive itself, one thing you'll notice on most of the motherboards is they will have screw holes here in different places. That's because these drives do come in different lengths, and so you can adjust for that based on the length of your solid state drive. So this motherboard comes with some screws that allow you to install that where it needs to go. And so let me just open that, and we'll get one of our little bins there. And so you can see this little piece here is going to screw into this particular hole, and so you can see that right there. I'm just going to screw that in, and so now I'm ready to actually install the drive. So the way you do that is you just put this in at roughly a 45-degree angle into the slot right here. Turn that so you can see. Now it just sort of sticks up, and you just simply push that down toward the standoff that I just installed, and then I'll take the screw that came with that. And I don't know why, but most of the solid state drives don't actually come with the screws, and maybe it makes sense if you think about it. Most of these motherboards handle the installation of these differently. Some have a little built-in catch that you can just turn and rotate it, and it's in place. In this case, you actually have to screw that in. And so that's it. We've installed the solid state drive, and so now I'm ready to reinstall the heatsink. And so it's very simple. Just match up the screws with these 2 spots here, screw that down. It's as simple as that. Very, very simple to do. Now, if you have other drives, other types of drives like a hard disk, or some of the older, more traditional solid state drives that are this shape, then that would come at a later step. I'm not going to install those in this particular machine, but I will demonstrate how to install those different types of drives later in the video. Next, we're going to install this particular CPU cooler. Of course, your cooler is probably going to be different, and the procedures will be similar, but they will be different. So just understand that what you're going to see here is the procedure for this particular cooler, although a lot of things that I'll talk about and show you are going to apply no matter what kind of cooler you're using. So let's go ahead and get this one open. And you can see the box of parts that came with this. There are a number of different mounting brackets and a couple of tools here. This is a tool that we'll use to screw things together. We even have some thermal paste if that was something that you didn't have separately, and some instructions, some clips here for installing fans. One of the things to mention about the various coolers is that there are, as we talked about before, there are a lot of different CPUs that you could be using, and thus there are a number of different types of sockets that are on the various motherboards that you might be using. And what most of the manufacturers of these fans do is they try to accommodate a lot of different socket sizes so that their fans apply to all kinds of different computer builds, so they don't have to make one for every specific type. So what you see here in this bag are a variety of mounting brackets. This particular cooler supports both AMD and Intel processors, and not just one, but several versions of those from those manufacturers. So these different brackets that you see here will allow this to work with the different kinds of motherboards and sockets and CPUs. So I've got everything out of the box, and I've figured out which of the mounting brackets work with the particular LGA 1700 socket that I'm using. So I'm just going to dump all of those parts out here. You can see all of the different parts there. There's a number of things that we're going to need, and we also have this back plate. So we'll put those together in just a minute. Let's talk about a question that you may have. Should you install the cooler onto the motherboard before it goes into the case, or install the motherboard into the case and then install the cooler? Well, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's really what works for you. And so the reason that you may want to do it outside of the case, install the cooler onto the motherboard now, is it's simpler to see what you're doing, to get into things and get around the cooler and make the changes that you need to make. However, if you put the cooler on the motherboard and then put it into the case, the problem you may have is that you then have difficulty installing some of the wires that need to go attached to the motherboard. For example, there are some connection points like along here and here that are very close to where that cooler will be sitting. And because that cooler is so big, you may have a difficult time getting your hand in the case and around it. If you have a very large case that's very open, then that's probably not a problem. You may find that if you attach the cooler to the motherboard, put it in the case, and then have difficulty attaching some of the wiring, that you just have to take it out, take it apart, and put the motherboard in without the cooler on, make all the other attachments, and then install the cooler. So that's one thing that's up to you. I'm going to do it with the cooler attached on the outside, and you'll see that here in just a minute. Next, I'm going to install the cooler backplate. And you can see that here. What this backplate does is it will sit underneath or on the underside of this motherboard, and you will then attach, we're going to screw some things on the top of this, and that gives us a bracket onto which we can install the cooler. One thing this cooler manufacturer has done to allow this cooler to support a number of different socket sizes is to allow this backplate to work on several different versions of Intel's CPUs. And there is a change I have to make for the LGA 1700 socket that I have in my motherboard. If you look at where these screws are sticking up, they're actually adjustable. And so I can actually push that out. And now this will fit through the holes that are meant for this particular LGA 1700 socket. So I'll turn over the motherboard so you can see the underside, and then I will take this back plate and just simply push the holes those little screws through the holes that are right there. And you can see it actually would go in here either direction, and it should not make any difference. And then I'll turn that over. Now there are 4 screws protruding through the motherboard. You can see those here, 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 and here. Now I'm going to take these 4 little screws, standoffs, and install those onto the top of each of these little screws that's protruding through the motherboard. Screw each one of those on. When you're installing your cooler, you need to consider the direction of airflow through your computer's case. And I'd say most cases, there is a fan on the front side of the case that will pull air into it, and it will send air across, so it'd be coming in this direction, and there is going to be an exhaust fan on the back of that computer case that sends air out. The fan on your cooler can be attached in different directions. I want to make sure that I am working with the fans that are already a part of my case. So if I'm going to be bringing air in the front side of the case and sending it to the back, I want the fan on this cooler to be pushing air in the same direction. I don't want to fight those other fans because that may cause it to get actually hotter in the case. I've placed the cooler on top of the CPU just temporarily, just so you can see the way that the air is going to flow. So this would be the front of the computer case. Air would flow this way, and it's going to flow out the back of the case here. If you have a different case arrangement or your fans are arranged differently, you could rotate this and it could sit on top of the CPU in any of 4 directions. And that's okay. You just need to know ahead of time which way the air is flowing in your particular computer case. It's important as you're doing this to understand a little bit about the way computer fans are designed. The open part of the fan, this open face here, is where the air will enter and it goes out the back. And this, if you look at the side of this fan, that little indicator right there shows you the direction of the airflow. Not all fans will have that, but that's the way that this one is set up. I've removed the fan from the cooler for just a moment to show you what the back side of a typical fan looks like. So you can see on this one there are little pieces of plastic here that provide sort of a cage, and if you compare that to another fan that I have here, so if you look at the back side of that one, very similar. And so the idea here is, again, that the open face is where the air flows in, and the back side with the cage on it is where the air is going to flow out. Once you've decided on how the air is going to be flowing and how your cooler needs to be oriented on the socket, then you can look at the brackets and decide how they need to attach to the back plate that you've already installed. For this particular cooler, there are 2 brackets that I need to attach. And so you have to look at the way that those are oriented. You can see this bracket actually has the word CPU indented in the metal and a little arrow that points toward the CPU. These brackets could sit in that direction, like that, or they could be on the sides, like that. Because I know that my airflow is going to be like this, which means that it sits like this. The attachment points on the bottom of the cooler are here, and so I need to make sure that the attachment points on these brackets match up with that here and here. So now I've determined the brackets need to go there. I actually have to secure those, and so there's a couple more screws that I had to get out of the box. You can see those screws here. There's actually a place for a Phillips head screwdriver there. And so on the bottom part, this is the part that actually goes directly onto the screw. Now, oftentimes on these brackets, there are numbers. You can see the numbers right there. And those tell you roughly where these brackets need to sit on the attachment points that are here. In my case, it needs to go on number 2. Sometimes getting the bracket to sit just in the right place is a little bit of a challenge because these really don't have a absolute perfect place that they sit, and so you just do the best you can is what I say to that. So I'm trying to tighten these down so that it's on the second hole. So I've gotten those hand tightened. Now I'm just going to give them just an extra little bit of tightening with my screwdriver. So I'm extra sure that that is going to stay in place. I don't want that moving. You know, your fan is one of the few moving parts inside your case, so you want to make sure it's solid and where it's positioned. We're almost ready to install the cooler onto the CPU, but we do need to do one more thing, and that's install thermal paste. So what is thermal paste? Why do we need that? Is it necessary? And yes, it is necessary. The reason is that we need to make sure we can conduct heat away from the CPU up and out of the case. And that can't happen as nearly as well without the thermal paste. So what does thermal paste do? Well, if you think about it, what we have here are two metal surfaces on the top of the CPU and the bottom of this cooler. And if we just attach them, put them together without anything in between, those surfaces are going to come together, and it may be hard to see to the naked eye, but you're going to have some difference, and there's air pockets that can be formed in there. And even in a microscopic level, if you look at the surfaces of these metals, there are small air pockets or air holes. And so what we have to do is fill that up with something that will help conduct heat away from the CPU and out of the case. So that's what thermal paste does. It basically fills in the gaps and makes sure that we have a good connection thermally from the CPU to the cooler. So then the next question is, well, how do we apply that? And if you go to YouTube and watch videos, you're going to find dozens, if not hundreds of videos about how to apply thermal paste the right way. There are different patterns that people suggest, for example, just one big blob right in the middle, or an X, or 5 dots, etc. And so my opinion on that is I'm not going to depend on the squishing of the paste to get it covered correctly. So when you put a big dot in the middle, for example, then the idea is that when you put this down onto that big blob, it eventually squishes all of that thermal paste out onto the entire face of the CPU, but you're hoping that that's going to happen. So what I prefer to do is actually spread the paste out, and that way I know for sure that I've covered everything. Now, one concern that people might have is, well, if I put too much, if I get it too far out, it might actually squish out and touch some metal contacts that could cause a short, even damage some parts, or maybe even make the computer not work. So in my case, this thermal paste is non-conductive of electricity. It conducts heat, but it does not have any metals in it that can conduct electricity. So even if I get too much and some of that squishes out of the top of the CPU, that's okay. So I'm going to take this paste out, and you can see this one actually, here's the paste, and here is a little spatula that comes with it. You can see that here. What I'm going to do is what maybe some people call buttering the toast. I'm going to put the thermal paste on here and then spread it evenly. Now, I'm not worried so much about the initial pattern that I'm placing this down. The whole point is that I'm going to spread this out, and I may need to add some more. And look, if this isn't your exact method of painting, then so be it, but I'm trying to just get this on here evenly. So there you go. I have buttered my toast or frosted my cake, and I feel very confident that I've got a good coverage on there, and I think this will give us a good connection between the CPU and the cooler. One last thing to remember before you install the cooler onto the CPU is to check the bottom or the contact point of your cooler to see if there is a cover. And so you can see in this case, this has a cover and it's printed. It tells you to please remove this, but not every single cooler is going to have that. So it may be there, but you may not realize it's there. So just make sure, check it before you put it on. Otherwise, you're not going to have a good connection, and your computer is probably going to overheat. So be sure to get this. So I'm going to pull this off. And so now I've got a clean surface. And one last thing I'll do is I'm going to remove the fan. I think it'll be easier to attach this properly. There are two clips. You can see one here and one here. It's very easy to just simply pull that up, and that will allow the fan to detach from the cooler. And so this will be off just temporarily, because you actually have to have it off to be able to get access to this screw point. Now I'm ready to actually attach this to the two screw points. This particular cooler comes with a little tool specifically made to fit into these screw holes here. So you can screw that down. And so that's grabbing. I'm going to do it a little bit at a time on each side. And this one I actually have to take the top off. And the access hole to get to the other screw is right down through the middle of this cooler. And so I can make sure that it's on there and it's screwing on and it's attaching itself properly. So I do a little at a time so it goes down evenly. I've got that screwed on now, and I just need to replace the top here and then put the fan back on. This cooler is almost completely installed. There's just one last step, and that's to connect the electrical power. And the way you do that is there is a cable, obviously, coming from this fan. And if you look on the motherboard here, you can see right here, this says CPU fan. And so this is the cable, and there's only one direction that you can put this in, and that will go just like that. And that's the installation of the entire process. So a couple of thoughts I want to give you before we move on to the next segment. You need to make sure you get a case, obviously, that's big enough for a cooler like this. This is kind of a medium-sized cooler. There are coolers that are bigger, and so you need to make sure your case can accommodate that, as well as a graphics card. Some of the graphics cards today are pretty sizable, so get a case that's big enough for that. The other thing to think about is the position of your RAM. Your RAM sticks, sometimes these can get in the way of the cooler. This cooler is actually high enough that the fan doesn't come in contact with the RAM, but there are some coolers where it doesn't lift up high enough, and this fan would actually be hitting onto the RAM, and it would prevent you from even using a couple of the slots in some cases. The last thing I want to say is when you reattach this fan to the cooler and all these radiator fins here, well, where do you put it? Is there a specific place? And well, not necessarily. You can pick and choose whichever one you want it to go on. Try to note that when you take the fan off, but you can put them on anything as long as it's fully covering the side that it's sitting on. You're good to go. Hey, thanks for sticking with me this far, and I just want to remind you, you can do this. If you've never built a computer before, or if you haven't done it in a long time, you can do this. This is not rocket science. Ignore the rockets that are back there. You know, it's really just like putting together Legos. You follow some simple instructions. You use pieces that are pretty much the same from one manufacturer to another. They go together the same way every time. So it's really something that I think anybody can do it. So keep going. And if this is the kind of content that is helping you, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and subscribe if you need this kind of help in the future. I'd love to see you in future videos. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to take the case out of the box. We'll put the power supply in, and we'll get this motherboard installed and hook up the wires, and we're going to be ready to go. Let's go. I've got the case out of the box. This is a Lian mid-tower case. What that means is it's a mid-sized case. There's full tower cases, and then there are other bunch of smaller type of cases. This was great size, I think, for a first-time build. If you've never built a computer before, you probably don't need a full tower case because they're just really overkill unless you're building a server or have a whole bunch of disk drives that you need to put into a case. So again, I'd consider a mid-tower case building your first computer. And of course, you have to consider the size of your motherboard and the form factor of your motherboard. I'm using an ATX motherboard, and so this case is meant to work with an ATX motherboard. So consider that, check your case requirements once you know what motherboard you're going to use. And this case, we're here on the front side of the case. That's what we see here. This is a mesh, so there's great airflow that comes into this. And let me take the cover off here so you can see what is behind it. And this is has 3 different fans. There are these are 120 millimeter fans, and they're RGB fans, which means they're going to light up in pretty colors. Now, I'm not making that a big deal about this build. This just happens to be the way this case was made. But if you're wanting to build a computer with a bunch of lighting, then a case like this is a good start. So that's where the air is going to flow in on the front of this. We talked about this earlier, and then it's going to flow to the back of the case and give us good airflow. So that's the front of the case. We also have on the sides, we have glass panels. Not all cases are glass. You may have just metal sides, and if that's the case, then you're just simply going to remove those. You're just going to go to the back of the case. There's usually 2 screws, maybe 3 screws on the back, and you can just undo those and remove the sides. And on this particular case, we have a couple of places here on either side. This little section here will drop down here, and then on this side as well. This will pop down, and then that allows easy opening of the glass doors here and there. And so these are also removable glass doors. You want to, I would suggest, definitely take off the glass doors when you are first building your computer. They are breakable, even though they may be tempered glass. Even if they break, they're still going to hurt you, or it's going to hurt your pocketbook. So definitely take these off. If you open one up, and on the back, I'll show a close-up of this in a minute, but I can easily just lift this up off of the hinges, and it comes off. Makes it very simple to remove that, put this somewhere safe, and then when we're done, there is some film on here that will peel off on both the front and the back sides, and that will keep it safe until you're ready to actually put it into use. So let me show you how to take off the other side. So I turn the computer around so you can see the actual hinge here. And so if I just, the easiest way I think to do this, the safest way, is to grip it on right near the edge of the hinges here and just pick it up from the top and the bottom. Just lift that right off, and there's just a couple little pegs here that allow you to easily put this back on or take it off. And of course, every one of these cases is different. All the manufacturers try to make it their special way, and so that's why I would definitely take a look at the booklet that comes with your case, because this is going to really explain all of the different capabilities. If you take a look at this, turn it upside down, take a look at the inside of this, you can see, I mean, this really has a lot going on. Just the capabilities that are built into this particular case. So it's a great day to build a computer. So here's a suggestion for how you could store your glass doors while you're working on the computer. You can put them into the original box that the case came in. I'm just, you can see here, separating the 2 pieces of glass with the styrofoam that was around the case. And that's going to keep the glass doors safe while I'm working on the computer. Your computer case will likely come with some screws and other goodies that will help you when you put everything together. And in this particular case, those come in this little section down here at the bottom. And these are meant for installing hard drives. But if you open the very bottom one, at least the way I got it today, if you open that up, inside there you get a little toy surprise. There's my box of goodies. So you can open this up, and inside this you will see there are a number of screws and tie wraps and other things that will help me actually put everything together. So I'm going to put some of these in my little magnetic bins here, and some of them I'll leave in here. It's a great thing to keep after we're done, because there probably will be some things left over, and you can keep this for use later. So I'm going to get everything squared away here, and we'll start actually putting this together. The very first thing I want you to install into your case is your I/O shield. And what's an I/O shield? Well, that's this shiny piece of metal in this hermetically sealed plastic bag. And why is it sealed in this plastic bag? I have no idea. Maybe it's to keep it fresh, but we're going to open that now. And there we go. There's our I/O shield, and you can see it's very shiny, and you will have one with your motherboard. This is the bane of many computer builds. Many first-time builders forget to put these in, and so I'm going to help you to not do that by telling you to do this the first thing before you do anything else. What is an I/O shield? What's it for? Do you need it? Do you have to put it in? Well, if you ask the Federal Communications Commission and other regulatory bodies around the world, they will tell you, yes, you need to install this. It's designed to prevent electromagnetic or radio frequency interference. And so this is going to be installed right here around where the various inputs and outputs, that's what the I/O stands for, are attached to the motherboard. And so it's supposed to help prevent leakage of signal so that it does not, your computer does not interfere with other devices, and other devices don't interfere with your computer. If you look at the shield closely, you'll see these little metal prongs. Don't take those off. They are there to help ground the ports that are on your motherboard, so that when you're installing something or plugging something in or taking it out, you do reduce the risk of any kind of static discharge, and that could help prevent damage to your computer. So again, leave those things on. And of course, your shield does help prevent dust from getting into this space. Not that, I mean, there's lots of other holes on here, but it will at least prevent dust from getting in around that area. This I/O shield is designed to work specifically with this motherboard, and the same is going to be for whichever motherboard you get. You will receive one of these, and it's going to work only with your motherboard. They may be interchangeable, but most of the time they are not. That's because the arrangement of the various ports that are offered by your particular motherboard are not going to be the same as other motherboards. So make sure you get this out and save it. Don't throw it away. And we're going to install it next. Now let's take a look here at the side of this shield. You can see these little bumps here along the side. See it on all four edges of this. So what I'm going to do is install this here, and it's basically going to come in from the inside of the case and be pushed through, and those little bumps that you saw are going to grab and they will hold it in place. You do need to get the orientation of the shield correct. It could go in either this way or this way. So if you just look at this particular shield, you'll see it has printing on it. So right there it says HDMI, so that's telling you this is would be where your HDMI port would be. Keep in mind that that writing would be facing out, so you would see, if you held it through here, you'd be able to read it. The other way you can tell if you've got it oriented correctly is if you were to take your motherboard and actually put it into the case and just temporarily put that through there. And so now you can see where the different ports are, and if I hold this up, you can see roughly where those different ports are. Why did I encourage you to install this first? Well, if you don't install this first, if you already have your motherboard secured in there, you're not going to be able to actually then install the shield. It has to go in first, and then your motherboard will be flush up against it on the inside of the computer, and you cannot get these in or out with the motherboard installed. It's very easy to install this once you know a couple of tricks. The first thing I would recommend that you do is if you have your tower sitting up like this, you actually want to turn it on its side, because then you're not fighting with trying to push this over as you're pushing this on the inside. So I'm going to set this down just like that. You can see this opening where we are about to install this I/O shield, and along here where my finger is a very thin little edge all around the opening where these little bumps on the edges of this I/O shield are going to grasp onto this little piece of metal. If you watch, you can just see as I just sort of angled this in, and those bumps are going to grab onto that edge, and I can easily push now on all four corners at the same time, or if it helps, you can just do a couple at a time. But if I push, those start to pop into place. I'll pop on the one there and another one there, and so now we have officially installed the I/O shield, and I can just visually inspect to make sure that I can't see any of those bumps and make sure that this is actually all the way on. You can do it. We're ready to install the motherboard, or are we? Well, there's one question that some people have at this point in the build, and that's, should you install the power supply before or after the motherboard? So in the old days, the power supply was normally installed at the top, so up here, and they tended to get in the way. And here's an example of that. Power supplies were usually not modular, meaning that there was a permanently attached bundle of wires coming out of the power supply. And the cases did not make it easy to route the cables, so they were out of the way. Thus, the wiring got in the way while installing the motherboard. So installing the power supply after the motherboard made a lot of sense. Now, with modular power supplies that let you only install the cables that you actually need, and with most cases actually moving the insulation location of the power supply to the basement or the bottom of the case, usually about somewhere right there, it really makes no difference whether you install the motherboard before or after the power supply. So I'll install the motherboard first. Before you install your motherboard, you need to verify what form factor your motherboard uses. The most common is ATX, but there are others, for example, micro ATX, mini ITX, and more. Check the specs or documentation for your motherboard if you're not sure. And if you buy a motherboard online, the form factor is almost certainly included in both the product name and description. ATX is short for Advanced Technology Extended, and that's a standard for motherboards that was patented all the way back in 1995, the old days. So it's really stood the test of time. The ATX standard determines the specification about your motherboard, such as its size and placement of mounting holes. Whichever form factor your motherboard uses, you do have to make sure your case supports that form factor. Otherwise, it may be impossible to install the motherboard in the case. Many cases support multiple form factors. This particular case supports 3 motherboard form factors. You can see right here, imprinted on the metal itself, is a simple guide that helps you to set up your case so it works with your chosen motherboard. Your case might not have this, so you may need to consult your case documentation. Notice the various holes and the letters next to those holes. The holes that have an A next to them also have a little metal thing screwed into this base plate. That metal thing is called a standoff, and if you look carefully at all of the currently installed standoffs, they're in the holes labeled A. Some of the holes have more than one letter next to them because they fit the spacing of more than one type of motherboard. This board came with the standoffs pre-installed in the ATX holes. If you buy a mid-tower case, it will probably come with the standoffs pre-installed for an ATX motherboard, but do verify the placement before installing your motherboard. And if your motherboard is something other than ATX, then definitely verify if the standoffs are in the correct holes. If not, just remove them from the incorrect holes and install them in the correct ones. Look at your motherboard and locate the mounting holes. My motherboard has 6 mounting holes, and you can see those here. It's easy to miss 1 or 2 on the maze of circuits and parts, so check your manual if you're not sure. Make sure there are standoffs installed on the case base plate that correspond with where those mounting holes are on the motherboard. So why do you even need standoffs? Well, standoffs lift the motherboard away from the metal case, so the circuits on the bottom of the motherboard don't make contact with the case and cause an electrical short. This would be bad. So do not install the motherboard directly to the base plate without standoffs. It's possible there will be a standoff installed in the case that does not match with the mounting holes on your motherboard. If so, it's important to remove it. Otherwise, it can damage the motherboard when you install it or turn the computer on after completing assembly. To remove a standoff, you can use a nut driver like this one that's included with this case, and you just place that over a standoff. And then using a Phillips head screwdriver, you just unscrew it. My kit here with the various bits includes a nut driver bit, and you can just attach that to the included screwdriver and easily use that to remove a standoff. If you don't have either one of those, just use some needle nose pliers or some regular pliers to grip the standoff and remove it. It's possible that your motherboard will have mounting holes where there is not a corresponding hole in the case base plate, and that's okay. And you may have standoffs pre-installed in holes meant for your motherboard's form factor, but that are not needed. For example, my motherboard only has 6 mounting holes, which is fairly common for ATX motherboards, but there are 9 pre-installed standoffs for ATX motherboards in this particular case. These 3 standoffs are not used by my particular motherboard. There's no need to remove those unused standoffs unless for some reason they're in your way. One final thing to mention before I install this motherboard. This center standoff is slightly different from all the others, and you can see this comparison of what I'll call the self-centering standoff and the other regular standoffs. The self-centering standoff sticks up slightly, and it's like that on purpose to help self-center or guide the motherboard into the correct position. Some of these self-centering standoffs will have a place where you can insert a screw, just like the regular standoffs. This one here will accept a screw, but some of the self-centering standoffs are just a solid standoff and you can't insert a screw into them. And that's okay because you will still screw the board down with other standoffs. Once you've verified all the standoffs are correctly positioned, you're ready to insert the motherboard. Now, I recommend setting the case flat rather than trying to install the motherboard with the case standing up like this. If you install it upright, you will probably break something and then you will cry. There's no crying in baseball or computer building, so I've got the case lying flat. And so now you want to just pick up your motherboard very carefully, and you want to look at where your I/O ports are and think about those. And as you insert the motherboard, you want to aim those I/O ports at the I/O shield that we just installed. And you can see that the ports are lining up properly with the holes in the I/O shield. And so now you want to carefully lay the motherboard down on top of those standoffs. And this is where this light starts to come in handy. So the great thing is it's magnetic on the bottom. So you can just turn that on and stick that somewhere on the side of the case or wherever makes sense to light up what you're doing. So one thing to note is this I/O shield does have these little metal pieces, and they can push against what you're trying to do to get this motherboard in place. So just be aware you may have to push it toward the I/O shield just a little bit. And if it's not already, you want to get that self-centering standoff that sticks up to come through its respective hole in the motherboard. And there we go. And once you have that standoff properly positioned, then you want to just take a look at the other mounting holes and move the motherboard around, if it even will move, just so you can see if the other standoffs are in the right place below the motherboard. And having your light, you might be able to see a little better what you're doing and be able to see where those standoffs are. You may have problems seeing every single standoff, but that should take care of itself as you begin to fasten down the board. So I like to start with screws on opposite corners, which can help to properly position the board over the remaining standoffs. So now grab your Phillips head screwdriver, this little kit that has all the bits. Of course, it has Phillips head screwdrivers, and the great thing about this one is it's magnetized. One of the things that's hard to do is sometimes get your hands down inside of the case now that this fan is up against the case. And so to try to get a little bitty screw in there is kind of hard. So if you just put that on the end of your screwdriver, it'll stick there with that magnet. And I'll move my light just a little bit, give me a little more light. And there we go. And I'll move the light down here on this end, and I'm ready for the one on the opposite corner closest to me here. And that goes in very easily. And I'll just keep adding all of the different screws until I've got all of them installed. So now just insert all the screws that came with your case and tighten those down, but don't make them too tight or you might crack the board or damage it. So just be very careful. You don't have to over tighten these things. It's not critical. So install as many mounting screws as will go into your case, and don't leave out a screw unless there is not a standoff below the hole. And you want to double check before you're done that the I/O shield here is still properly seated and all of the ports are visible. So pretty easy, right? You're almost done, so keep going. Now it's time to install the power supply. And you'll often see power supply abbreviated as PSU, short for power supply unit, and I will use PSU and power supply interchangeably. So let's unbox this power supply. This is an 850 watt power supply, and it's basically very simple. You have the power supply itself, and we have a bag full of power cables. And so there's a supply of a bunch of cables. This is the cable that goes from the back of the computer to the wall where you plug it in. And then we have a couple of, actually 4 screws here to attach the power supply to the case itself. Before I forget, I'm going to remove these 4 screws, stick them in my little magnetic bin here. You can see we have a whole bunch of different cables here, and that's great because it gives us flexibility when we are connecting all the different components in the computer. So as I touched on earlier, power supplies may have a permanently attached bundle of cables, or they can be semi-modular with permanent and removable cables, or fully modular, meaning all the power cables are removable. This PSU is fully modular. And generally the cheapest power supplies will be the non-modular type. So if budget is a concern for you, you can save money by buying one of those. However, you definitely want to be sure just to get a PSU that supplies more than enough power for all of your computer's components. And if you can afford it, I do recommend fully modular. Your computer build will be easier and your case is going to look nicer because you have fewer cables inside. This needs to be facing out, and so that helps us to know part of our orientation for how this is going to be installed. This needs to stick out. The big question for installation of the PSU is, should you install it with the fan, that's this part right here, facing up or facing down, or does it even matter? Well, my general answer is that it does not make a great deal of difference in temperatures and performance, but there are a few things to consider for the orientation of your power supply. It's important to understand how these fans work, and so this is the air intake. This is where air gets pulled in and then it's forced out the back through this area. Thus, it's getting pushed out of the case itself. So your case may dictate the orientation of the power supply. For example, if the case does not have a grill on the bottom below the power supply, then you really have no choice. You definitely need to have the fan facing up. Take a look at the back of the case where you attach the power supply to the case. Does the case allow the PSU to be installed in either direction? If you look at the power supply, you'll notice that the 4 screw holes are in this odd arrangement that is not symmetrical. And that's the industry standard arrangement. What that means is that the case must have extra screw holes to accommodate the fan being installed in either direction. Here's the back of the case from one of my older computers, and you can see that there are unused holes that would allow this power supply to be installed up or down. Here's the back of this new case that I'm building in today next to the power supply. Notice that the case only has 4 screw holes, so this particular case only allows for the installation of the power supply with the fan facing down. So just verify by looking at your case to see which way you need to install this, up or down. So another consideration is what type of surface you will be placing the computer on. If you're placing it on the floor and you have thick carpet, well, you should consider installing the power supply with the fan facing up. Otherwise, the air intake on the bottom may be blocked. Now, I have a carpet sample here, and so let's just put this under the case. You can see that there's really not much clearance between the carpet and the air intake. If you have a deep pile carpet, it can easily block the intake. You could always place the computer on top of a board or something like a chair mat. So my personal preference is to draw air from below the case, so down here, which brings in room temperature air. And if you turn the fan up, then you're pulling air from inside the case, and that's air that's probably a little hotter than the outside room temperature. But if you remember, this is near the bottom of the case and hot air rises, so it probably will not be as hot as other areas of the case. And if you have other fans in the case properly moving air through the case, then the temperature of that air should be acceptable as it goes through the power supply. The next question to answer is, should you install the modular power cables before or after you attach the power supply to the case? Now, the wires can be a little hard to install once you put the power supply inside the case, so I am going to install the wires first. Now, either way, you will have to determine which cables to install by taking a quick inventory of the parts in your computer build that you will need to power. At a minimum, you will need to power the motherboard. For that, you'll use this 24-pin cable. You can see that here. And some older motherboards may have a 20-pin connector, so often these cables will have a split. I can just pull that apart, and very easily I can just also click that back together. So it's meant for use on either a motherboard with a 20-pin connector or 24 pins. Now, if you look at the other end of this, because this is a modular cable, this has an interesting difference. You would think it would be 24 pins, but it's actually 18 pins here and then 10 pins. So your power supply may have something different, but just remember, it's always going to be either the 20 or 24 pin connector that actually plugs into the motherboard itself. That's standard across ATX motherboards. Now would be a good time to mention one thing, and that is, how do you know which end plugs into the computer side, the motherboard, or some of the components in the computer versus which end plugs into the power supply itself? And if you just look at the power supply here, these little holes, or I'd call those keys, those are all the same size, and so those are going to be where this end of this cable plugs in. You can see that little tab right there, and that one as well. And now if I go to the other end, this is the side that's going to plug into the motherboard. If you compare the size of the two tabs or clips right here and here, you can see they are a different size. It may not be real obvious looking at it from the video, but they are a different size. And so it would not be possible to plug this in anywhere on here because that clip is just too big. And if you look at some of the other cables in here, here's another example where this is the end that plugs in to the power supply here, and this is the end that would clip on or plug into something, a device inside of the computer. And again, it's maybe these are really close in size, but this is bigger than this clip that would go into the power supply. And if I tried to plug this in to the power supply here, it just simply will not go because it's that little clip is too big. Now I'll plug this into the power supply itself, and I'll start with this 18-pin connector and then do the 10-pin. So I just want to put that in right here, and you can see this does say ATX 24P. So the first one will go here, and maybe require a pretty firm push, and you do want to listen for a click, and of course you want to try to get this absolutely flush against the side of the power supply so that you know you have a good connection. And then next I'll do the 10 pin, And there you go, you heard that one click that time. So I'm ready to go with the motherboard power connector, and I'll just drape that over here. Then you're going to need power for your CPU, and this could be 1 or 2 cables. This particular board needs 2. If you look on the sides of these modular cables that are included with this power supply, you can see they're labeled CPU here, and on this other cable, this is also CPU. So if you look, this one is made for an 8-pin plug, and then we do have one of those. And this one is also made either for an 8-pin or a 4-pin. And so I have, in my case, I have an 8-pin and a 4-pin, but if I had an 8-pin and an 8-pin, this would also work for that. You can see these outlets on the power supply are labeled to tell you where your particular cables are going to go. And so you have different places here for the CPU and PCIe devices. And so you got them here as well. And you can just pick and choose which outlet you want to put those in. It should not matter. Of course, it has to fit the size of the cable. So there's one. And there's the next one. So we have the 2 cables that will be used for the CPU power. Next, if you're installing a GPU, you'll need a PCIe cable, or possibly 2 for that purpose. And so I've got one of those here. You can see it says PCIe on the side. Although I'm not installing a GPU in this computer, I will demonstrate how to install one. So I'm going to go ahead and add the 2 cables that I'll need for my particular GPU. And one thing I want to mention before I get into this is if you're installing a GPU that is rated for 225 watts or higher, you really need to install at least 2 cables and possibly more if you have a really high-end GPU. Now, the problem that you will run into, or the temptation you may run into, is if you see these cables here, if you look at the end of this, it has 2 sets of 8 pins, and these actually split off so that it could either be 8 or 6. And so you could potentially, if you had on your GPU, if it had 2 places where you could plug in 2 8-pin connectors, you might think, well, good, I can just do that with 1 cable. The problem with that is these cables aren't really rated for providing that much power. I think the limit's something like 150 watts per cable. And so the slot that it plugs into is good for 75 watts. And so you really need to, anything over 225, you need to add a second independent cable. So don't let this be a temptation. Even though you got the full 16 pins here, you really should just use a single cable for 8 pins, and then add a second cable for the next 8 pins. And if you have another one that is requiring even more pins, get a third cable, and so on. So that'll keep you safe, keep your computer from melting down, and save you some heartache. All right, so let me show you how to install these here real quick. I'll turn this around so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. And I'll just push that in. Good click there. And then the next one. And that's it. So I'm ready for the installation of that GPU later on. If you're installing hard drives or SSDs, solid state drives like these, then you will need 1 or more SATA power cables for those drives, and that's what this cable is right here. You can see what the SATA power port looks like. Note that this is a SATA power cable, not to be confused with a SATA data cable, which looks like this one. And so if you want to compare the two, you can see the difference, power versus data. And often a single SATA power cable will have power ports for multiple drives. So 1 cable may be sufficient for your build, even if you have more than 1 drive. This single power cable has 3 power ports, and it is okay to use this 1 cable to power 3 different devices simultaneously. So I'm not installing a hard drive or SSD that requires SATA power, so I will not install a SATA power cable at this time. I've already installed the NVMe M.2 drive, and that gets power directly from the motherboard. Now, if you have an older drive or device like an old fan or CD-ROM drive, those sometimes require a Molex power connector, and you can see that here. It's this 4-pin port here. If you have a device that needs Molex, go ahead and attach that to your power supply. I do not need Molex for this build. In fact, Molex is essentially obsolete and only used for legacy parts, so I would not be surprised if power supply manufacturers stop including these in the next couple of years. Now, you may need to provide power to other expansion cards, such as an extra USB port, certain types of RGB lighting, and any other device that you might install into your computer. I've got all these cables left over, but remember that really cool black bag that came with the power supply? There you go. The way you install the power supply will depend on the way your case is made. Now, some cases have a faceplate or a bracket that you first have to remove from the case. It's usually right in this area around here. And then you'll take that and attach it to the power supply and then slip the whole thing right into the back of the case like that. And then just screw it all back together. However, most cases will require that you just slip the PSU in from the side, either side. In this case, it'll only go in from this side, and then I would attach that to the case at that point. So I'm ready to actually put the power supply into the case. One thing I would suggest, just double check before you actually insert it that all of your cables are pushed in carefully and clicked into all of the spots where they need to go. And then think about the fan, which way you plan to orient that. So in my case, it's going to go facing down, and then start to just slide that in sideways and aim that in toward the back of the case where that opening is. And one thing to note, every case is different, but if you have some things that are in the way, for example, this is a place to install hard drives and solid state drives, and it actually is movable. So if this was in the way, I could slide it over that way. So just note what capabilities your case has. If things are in the way and you can't get the power supply in, you may be able to move other parts of the case out of the way. Now I'm thinking about where I'm going to route these cables in later steps, and pretty much all the cables are going to come out in this direction and then go up the back side and attach on the front side of the motherboard. So right now these cables are all facing the way they need to be, but if you have some particular place that if you need to, for example, bring a cable out the other direction, then you could go ahead and do that now. So next I want to line up the screw holes, and you can see there we go. We got all 4 of the holes here, 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 and here. You can see those through the case. And now I'm going to install the screws. And I'll just go ahead and put that in part of the way. So if I need to do any fine movements, fine tuning of where the placement of the other holes are, I can do that. All right, so I've got all of the screws in, so now I'm just going to crank all of them down, get those fairly tight. I think you'll find that most power supplies include installation screws, and your case probably will too. But if yours did not, or if you lose the screws, don't worry. Power supplies are usually attached with what are called 632 screws, and you can see a close-up of those here. The head is usually hex-shaped or 6-sided, and they're the most common type of screw used in computer assembly. They're used for attaching hard drives, case side panels, and other parts and components in addition to power supplies. And that's it for installation of the power supply, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Next, let's install hard drives and solid state drives like these. Now, I've already installed the NVMe drive in this computer, and that's the only drive I will be installing right now. But I did want to show you how to install these drives just to make sure you understand the general process. These types of drives are still common, and lots of viewers will be wondering how to do this. Just remember that every computer case is different, so what I'm going to demonstrate will be for this case. However, the concepts are the same from one case to the next. So let's start with the hard drive. Now these are large and they used to be the only option you had for installing a drive in a computer. So older cases devoted a very large amount of space where multiple drives like this could be installed. But today they have been really relegated to a much smaller space within the cases. So in this case there are 3 designated spots or drive bays, and you can see those here. And you first have to pull out one of these trays or caddies and attach the drive to this. These caddies can actually be used for the large 3.5-inch drives, that's this, or you can install 2.5-inch drives like this solid state drive, or this is an old drive from a laptop that I removed. To attach a hard drive, you will use the 6 screw holes on the sides of the caddy here. Those match up with the 6 holes on the sides of the drive. Now, my case included standard hard drive screws, which are still in this little box here. And here is one of those screws. Let's talk about screws for just a moment, because getting this right is important to avoid damaging your equipment. Now, as I mentioned previously, the 632 screws are used for attaching power supplies, hard drives, and other parts. But these 632 hard drive screws are slightly different from the other 632 screws we use to attach the power supply. You can see in this side-by-side comparison, the main difference is the size of the head. The smaller head allows the drives to be placed into very tight spaces. Now, here's where you run into problems building your computer. This is an M3 screw, and you can see those here. Now, these are the same screws we use to attach the motherboard to the case. These are also used in these smaller drives, the solid state drive and this old laptop hard drive. You can see in this side-by-side comparison, the M3 screws look similar to the 632 hard drive screws. They are close in size, but they are not the same. The M3 screw has a slightly smaller diameter and the threading is very different. That difference in threading can tear up the threads that are machined into the holes on your drive if you insert the wrong screw. Now, I can incorrectly put this 632 screw into this small drive here. Now, the screw will go in, but not easily, and you can see how far I was able to get it in before I started feeling resistance. And if you proceed to screw it in with some force, you will damage the threads inside the drive. And likewise, I can put this M3 screw into this large hard drive. And you can see that's about as far as that will go in without me feeling some resistance as I turn it. But the screw won't go in any further without a screwdriver. And if I force it, I'll damage the threads inside the hole. Here's the key to using the right screw in the right device. If you can't screw it in by hand, it's the wrong screw. Said another way, if you have to use a screwdriver to make the screw go in, it's the wrong screw. When you have the right screw in the right hole, it will go in without resistance, and you can easily screw it in by hand without the need for a screwdriver. So use 632 screws when attaching large 3.5-inch hard drives, but use M3 screws with the 2.5-inch hard drives and solid state drives. If you do a visual comparison, the difference is obvious. The M3 screws have more threads per inch than the 632 screws. If you start trying to insert a screw and it's not going in easily, stop. You probably have the wrong screw. Now, if you've already put the wrong screw in the wrong hole, is it the end of the world? Well, no. Your drive is okay. You just may find in the future that the screws aren't very secure. Fortunately, there are multiple holes for inserting screws. Hopefully you have the right screws in some of those holes. Back to installing hard drives. Some cases may require that you attach rails to the side of the drive, so you'd attach those here, and then you would push that into a slot in the case. Or the case may just have brackets that you slip the drive into and attach screws to hold the drive in place. Hard drives also have 4 screw holes on the bottom, and it's possible to attach a drive with those holes if the case makes that possible. For my case, I'll screw this hard drive into this caddy, and remember to face the power and data connection so that the ports are facing toward the side opposite this latch here. So the data and power ports are on this side. If you attach all 6 screws, and you can see them lined up in the caddy right there, then you can't put this in the wrong direction. If the screws are too long or the head is too big, they can stick out here and prevent the caddy from sliding in. So make sure you use screws that came with your case or screws that are not too long. And you definitely don't want to over tighten these screws because it's real easy to destroy the threading that's inside the drive itself. Once the drive is attached to the caddy, just slide the caddy into the case. Now you have to make sure to catch this little hook here onto the frame and then press down on the other side here so that it will lock into place, and that will click and the drive is now going to be secured in the case. So I'll just slide the drive in, and you have to keep this door open just a little bit, and there's just a spot here where we're going to catch that little hook I showed you onto this part of the frame, and that caught, and now it clicked in, and that drive is not going anywhere. I'll turn the computer around to the back, and you can see the data and power ports here. Those are ready to be connected. Now, I did not install a SATA power cable since I'm not actually installing a hard drive in this computer, but if this was a real installation, I would locate the SATA power cable and pull it out through here and then connect it to the drive. So I'll just pretend that I'm doing that. So here's the SATA power cable, and this is the end that would be plugged into the power supply, so that would be in here somewhere. And so then I would take the end that has the SATA power port and just come right here, and that would attach to that port right there. Installing the SATA data cable is simple. You just take that data cable and again plug right into the data port on the back there. So I'm going to put my finger up through the hole where this cable is going to go so you can see exactly where this is. I'll turn this around now. So you can see my fingers are right there, and the SATA data ports are these gray ports right here under my finger. So I'm just going to bring the cable right through there, and of course this is a pretty ugly red cable, so you may not want to use that color if you're trying to make your case look pretty. Now I just simply have to connect to that port, and there it is. Of course, what you see down here, those cables won't be visible because this will be closed. But that's basically the only amount of wire that's going to be exposed. So it's a very simple way to keep your cables hidden by routing it the right way. The procedure for installing a solid state drive or the smaller hard drive, which is normally installed in a laptop, is very similar to installing the larger drive. In this case, these smaller drives can be installed in multiple locations. Now, again, your case will have its own locations for installing these small drives. These drives have 2 holes on either side of the drive. You can see those here. And they also have 4 holes on the underside. So you have flexibility for the way you attach these to your case. Now, these caddies here have, if I take one of these out, you can see these have 4 holes. And that's meant for you to install the drives onto those right there. 2 more drives can be installed here on this PSU shroud. So there's 2 places here and then around on the back. They can also be installed here, here, down here, and down here. So there's all kinds of places to put these in this particular case. So let me install this solid state drive into this caddy. And remember, we're using the M3 screws for the solid state drive. And of course, because I've chosen the right screw, these screws go in without any resistance whatsoever. It's very obvious that they are being used in the right type of hole. All right, so I've got the drive installed into the caddy, and I'm just going to turn this around. Once again, got to get this hook to catch on the frame in just the right place. And now I can turn this around again, and you can see where the other drive is installed down here on the bottom. So if you remember, we had this SATA power cable here being used for this first drive. So now I have the second port that I want to connect to. And there we go. So we have both of those two drives installed on a single power cable. And of course, if I was actually installing this, I would connect a data cable right there and just bring it where this one is going as well, so that they would be plugged into the motherboard. So you can see the way these SATA power cables work. Having the two drives right here together, I use a single power cable to connect those. I do want to demonstrate one additional way to install a drive in this case. So I can remove this little metal plate here, lift that up. You can see it sits on a couple of little tabs that stick out. And so I just lift that up a little bit, that tilts out. And so now what I have to do is I have to mount the drive on the outside of this metal plate. And so now I'm just going to take my M3 screws. Again, these are the ones that get used in the smaller drives. So there's one. I'll put another one over here. Those are going in easily because they're the right screw. All right, so I've got a screw in all four corners. And so now I can just slide the metal plate onto this little tab here and here. And also I need to put these other two tabs inside that, like that. And that will go up and then slide down into the right place. And now I can attach the single screw that holds this whole thing onto the case itself. And so now I have to think about how do I attach the power and the data to this drive. And so one of the things I talked about previously was the fact that if you have one of these SATA power cables, and this one has 3 different places that I can get power from. So the way I have installed these previously, this will not reach to this drive up here. So what I have to do now is see if I can perhaps reconfigure this. I pulled those off. I can install this one up here. There's the first power for that one drive. Is it long enough? And look at that, I got it in. Let's get this other final power plug on the third drive. And there it is. I got all 3 drives installed on a single SATA power cable. And now I'm ready to go. I, of course, would have to hook up another data cable for that. And I did want to mention one thing. If you're wondering, does it matter which of these plugs you use to install your data cables in? Well, in most cases it doesn't. There may be a array that you could set up, and it might determine the order or the location that you need to install those, but check your manual. It shouldn't, in most cases it won't matter which of these you use to plug in your hard drive or your solid state drive. If you need to install a DVD or Blu-ray drive, this case would not work because it does not have a drive bay that opens to the front right here. You can see what that looks like in one of my older computers. Now, if you need to install an optical drive, be sure to pick the right kind of case that has the right drive bay. Look for a case with an external 5¼ inch drive bay. Since optical drives are mostly obsolete and this case doesn't support those, I won't be demonstrating how to install one in this video. There are external optical drives available which plug into a USB port, so consider getting one of those as an option if you need one. So that's it for installing drives, so let's move on to the next step. Now it's time to connect these power cables to the motherboard. We previously connected these to the power supply, and so now I'm going to connect the other end of those cables to the motherboard. You've seen the messy cables inside this old computer a couple of times now. Back in the dark ages, when so many more devices installed in computers required cables, and before cases were built with easy cable management options, this kind of mess was normal. However, today it's much easier to keep the visible or public side of your computer nearly cable-free so the air can flow and you can show off your computer proudly. We accomplish this by carefully managing where we route all the cables, thus the term cable management. I could just bring all these cables right up through this opening where I earlier routed the data cable for the drives, but that puts the cables in the way of airflow and it doesn't look as nice. Here's what the computer would look like if I connected the cables that way. You can see it's just cable ugly. This case and most modern cases make it easy to route cables out of sight behind the motherboard, so they pop out just where they are needed and plug in with very little of the cables exposed. I'll show you how to do that while I'm connecting all the various cables. The first thing I'll connect is the CPU power cable. My motherboard actually has 2 ports for CPU power cables. Yours could be 1 or 2. Those are going to plug in way up here in this dark corner hidden away. And these are probably the hardest to install because they can be difficult to access if you have a CPU cooler installed already like this one. So I'll tackle that first and just get it out of the way. On the back side of the case, let's look at how we route the cable. The 2 CPU cables are right here and they're labeled CPU, so we know which cables to use. Now there is a hole up here where I'm going to route the cables to get them through to the other side where they're going to plug in. And so this case has a removable metal cover here. Your case may or may not have something like that. Now I could potentially bring these cables outside of this metal cover and then into that hole, or I could bring it alongside the metal cover right here, or I could actually remove this metal cover, and that's what I'm going to do because I think it'll create a better route for the cables and it'll look nicer. So I can take this metal cover off and it just tilts out, and you can actually see there is a place here where those cables can be routed, so it's meant for that purpose. If I've got these 2 cables up here like this, yes, it's going to be visible down here. And if I had a drive installed here or here, I probably would want to route this on the side like this. It looks better and it's out of the way. But look, I'm about practicality when building a computer, especially your first time. This side is never going to be seen by anyone but me when I'm working on it. If your computer is going to be seen and it's all about appearance in your situation, then absolutely, I would bring this along the side here so that it's out of the way and looks completely clean, especially if you're going to have drives here. But again, I'm not concerned about that for this build, so I'm happy to have the metal plate covering this and just a little bit of the wiring exposed right here. So again, practicality for me, but do what works for you, and if you want it to be clean, I'd bring it over to the side like that. Both of these CPU power cables are 8-pin connectors, and both can be split like this so that they can be a 4-pin or an 8-pin connector. Notice that my CPU has 1 8-pin power port and 1 4-pin port. Your CPU might have a single 8-pin port, or a 4-pin and an 8-pin like mine, or 2 8-pin ports. Now I'll split one of these so that it is now the 4-pin connector that I need. And then now on the other side of the motherboard here, I'm going to show you how to install these 2 cables. These are the 2 power connection points for the CPU that are on the motherboard. And I'm going to install this 4-pin connector first, and then I'll do the 8-pin last. And so I have the cable that I have split into the 2. So I have a 4-pin. And so I'm going to insert those 2 through this hole. And you can use either one of these. It should not matter. I'll just use the one here that says CPU. It's sort of bent in the right direction. And so I have to, as you can see, I'm sort of bending this cable back on itself. And that clip here at the top needs to go on the top part of the motherboard's connection point. And so I just have to ease that on in and push it in until it will, you'll see that clip click on to, there it went, clicked right onto the motherboard, and that one is secure. And now I'll grab the 8-pin connector, and once again I have to sort of bend it back on itself. There we go. And just push that till it clicks. And there it went, it clicked. All right, so you can see how the cables are sort of bent backwards onto themselves. And that's it. We've connected the power for the CPU. If you wanted to make this look a little cleaner, you could bring this one back through the hole so it's not sticking out. If that is your OCD kicking in and you want to make that clean, but it should not make any difference in terms of airflow. You could do that if you wanted it to look a little cleaner. On the back side of the computer, I'm ready to reattach this metal plate. And of course you can see where the cables are falling. And so again, I just need to run them through one of these two openings on the metal plate here. I just need to drop this little tab down into where that attaches the plate. So I can just screw this back together. And there we go. And that looks clean. Now these cables, I will manage these at some point later. They're going to be sitting somewhere down here, and I may connect them with some others and group those together just to keep those sort of tight and out of the way. So we'll get to that later. And that's it for inserting the CPU power cables. Let's move on to the next step. I have one more power cable to connect right now. These two cables will connect to the GPU, but that comes a bit later. So this is the ATX 24-pin power cable, and it's easy to connect to this motherboard. Now I mentioned previously that your motherboard could have a 20-pin connector. If so, just separate this 4-pin part from this 24-pin and you're ready to plug in. The 24-pin power connector or power port is located up here along the edge of the motherboard, and that's where we're going to plug in right now. How does this cable get through to the motherboard side of the computer? Well, this is another metal plate here that I need to remove to get this cable installed, so I'll remove that now. Gravity gets you sometimes. And the power cable will come up this way and poke through right here to the motherboard side. Around here on the motherboard side, you can see where this will poke through and be right next to the connector. Just like the CPU cables, there's a clip here or a little latch on the side of the cable, and I'm going to click that on, or it's going to hook on to the side of the connector right here. So I'm going to bring the cable up and just aim that toward the connection. And you can see I'm having to bend this cable back, and yes, it does feel awkward, and that's okay, it's normal. And so now I'm just going to push that on into the connector, and you do sometimes have to push pretty hard, and you can see it does push back a little bit on the motherboard itself. But it did click. I didn't hear it, but I can tell, I can feel around the edge there isn't a gap between the connector and the cable itself. So that is a good connection. I could eyeball it. And this cable will, when we're finished, it will be lifted up here as I do the cable management a little bit later. Most cases will come with some cables pre-installed. The cables are there for a variety of reasons. Number one is so you have a working power button. You have to be able to turn the computer on, of course. But a typical computer will also include a reset button, some external USB ports, a headphone and microphone jack, pre-installed fans, which have power cables and may also include RGB lighting, and there may be other features on a case. The cables allow those features to work, but you will need to connect the cables to your motherboard first. Now on this case, when I earlier removed this metal plate so I could install the 24-pin power cable, you may have noticed this bundle of cables here. The cables are attached to a small circuit board up here at the top of the case, and that's where the power button, USB port, audio port, and RGB lighting controls are on the outside of the case. And some of these cables are connected to the 3 fans here on the front. Now the cables for your case will be similar, so you should be able to follow along with most of what I'm doing. These cables are held in place here with these 2 Velcro ties, so I'm going to loosen those and get all of these cables out. Now I know this might look like an impossible mess if you've never built a computer before, but rest assured that I will show you what to do with each one of these cables. First, let's tackle what many people consider the hardest, scariest, most frustrating, whatever you want to call it, connection that you will need to make, and that is these very small little cables here. Actually, just one is critical, and that's the one that is labeled Power SW. The rest of these are optional, but I certainly recommend that you install all of them. So I'm going to turn this around and show you how to install these cables. These will plug in down here on the lower right of this motherboard, and most ATX motherboards will position this system panel header down here in the lower right. And on most motherboards, the manufacturer will print a diagram of what the various pins should be connected to. You can see that for my motherboard printed right here, and the motherboard manual will show a diagram as well. There isn't an absolute standard for these across all motherboards or manufacturers, so check your motherboard manual or get your magnifying glass out and read the diagram that's printed on the board itself. Now, some of these cables have to be connected one way for that particular thing, whatever it is, to work properly. So polarity is important. In other words, the positive side of the cable needs to connect to the positive pin on the board, and the negative side of the cable must connect to the negative pin. But for some, the polarity does not matter. So we'll talk about that more in just a moment. So let me make one thing clear at the outset of this. If you connect the cable with the polarity backwards, you aren't going to damage anything. So just relax. You may find that something does not work, but your system is not going to blow up. If something doesn't work, just reverse the way you plug the connector in, and it should be fine. It should work just fine. And some of these connectors will have a plus or minus sign printed on them. Others do not. For example, on this power switch cable, you don't see plus or minus printed here. However, if you turn it over, you can see an arrow, and that arrow does indicate the plus or positive side of the connector. But here's the thing, the power switch connector can be installed either way, and the same is true for the reset switch connector. It can also be installed either way. So if you look at the diagram on my motherboard, those two connectors don't indicate positive or negative, whereas the power LED and the HDD LED do have positive and negative. My case only has 3 cables to connect. That's the power switch, the reset switch, and the power LED. However, your case might also add a speaker and a hard drive activity light and a chassis intrusion sensor. Of course, your motherboard will need to include pins on a header for those connections to make them work. This motherboard does not include a chassis intrusion header, for example. Now, I want to route these cables so they come out down here from the bottom of the case, and they'll be right there where they need to plug in, and that way they're barely visible when we're finished installing everything. On the back side of the computer here, I'll take this cable and push it up through the back, right through here, and bring it up through the front where we will need it. I'll start with the power switch cable, and this will allow the main power switch on the case up here to turn the computer on or off. On my motherboard, that goes on the 3rd and 4th pins on the top row. There is an arrow on the back side of this indicating the positive side, but it does not matter which way I install this. So I'll push that on, and I have the label side facing up, but again, I could install this facing down and it would still work, so don't stress about orienting this one. Next, I'll install the reset switch connector. The reset switch will reboot the computer if pressed. Now I'll turn this so the label faces down, but again, it does not matter. It can also be installed either way. I'll just push that onto the 3rd and 4th pin on the bottom row. Finally, I'll install the 2 separate power LED connectors. This cable pair will light up the power switch on your case when the computer is on. These are labeled with a plus and minus, and it does matter which way you install them. However, again, nothing is going to be damaged if you install them backwards. Now, on my motherboard, and probably yours, the positive connector goes on the 1st pin, and the negative connector goes on the 2nd pin. And guess what? On many motherboards, you'll find that the power LED connector can be installed in 2 different places, so I could install these over here instead. I'll first install the negative side because it's right next to the power switch. It's easier to work your way out. because if I had tried to stick that in between the plus side and the power switch, it's very hard to get those in between. So I'll work my way out. And so now I got the plus side on, and I'll just even those up, and that's how you get the power LED connectors installed. One final thing I'll install is a speaker. Now, I'm not talking about the speakers that you use to listen to videos, music, games, or anything like that. Years ago, most cases came with a small speaker attached to the case itself. When you turned on the computer, it would beep to indicate the post or power on self-test had completed successfully. Or if something went wrong during startup, the speaker could give a series of beeps that indicate a specific problem. So you could then diagnose and correct that problem. Now, since many cases no longer have these speakers, you can purchase a mini speaker like this one. Notice this spans 4 holes and it will plug onto these 4 pins, but only 2 are actually wired to the speaker. I'll plug it in with the label facing up, but the speaker will work in either orientation. This is what I'll hear now when I turn on the computer. The speaker isn't critical, but if you like to have some acknowledgement that the motherboard started up properly, this will do that for you. Finally, I'll clean everything by pushing these cables down so they're hidden, leaving us with a nice clean look. And the speaker can be heard from anywhere in the case, so I'll hide that down here too. And that's it for installing these pesky little connectors. We lived through it. That wasn't so bad, right? All right, well, let's plug in the rest of the front panel cables. I'll go clockwise on the motherboard. So up here, just below the 24-pin power connector, is the USB 3.0 connector. To complicate things, this is also known as a USB 3.2 Gen 1 connector. Bottom line, this is a cable that transfers data at 5 gigabits per second. So this connects to the USB ports on the outside of the case. And typically these ports look like these blue ports. However, they don't have to be blue ports. In fact, on this computer case, the ports are black. Now these are called Type A ports, which are these rectangular shaped ports. This is the USB 3.0, aka USB 3.2 Gen 1 cable, and I'll push that through here so that it comes out right where we will need it on the other side. The connector on this cable has a key here on one side, so you can only plug it in one way. There's also a single missing pin on the motherboard port up here at the top left, and you can see on the cable that one of the holes is blocked or missing. I'll turn this the right way so that the key matches up with the notch on the motherboard and push that in. Next is the USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C panel connector. This version of USB supports data transfer at up to 10 gigabits per second, and Type-C is this smaller rounded port. The Type-C port is the only type of USB that allows you to plug in cables and devices in either direction. The port on this motherboard is located right here. Here's the cable for that. I'll push that through so I can grab it on the front. Now, if you look at the connector closely, you'll see it's designed to plug in just one direction. So while the Type-C connector on the outside of the computer allows you to plug in cables and devices in either direction, the end of the cable that plugs into the motherboard must go in one specific direction only. Now, if you just look at the connector casually or without a magnifying glass, you may not be able to tell that this connector is shaped differently on each end. And if you try to plug it in, you will experience resistance if you plug it in the wrong way. Don't try to force it. If it doesn't click in easily, just turn it around and try it again until it plugs in. If your case supports USB 2 ports, this motherboard and most others will have ports where you could connect those cables. Those are located down here on this motherboard. Now, USB 2 is an older, much slower port, so fewer cases today will have exterior USB ports. This case does not have any USB 2 ports on the exterior, so I will skip that step. Last but not least is the audio header over here on the bottom left, and that is a common position for the audio header on most motherboards. This connects to the single audio port on this case, and that single port supports both headphones and a microphone, which means you will need to use an adapter if you need to access both headphones and a microphone on the outside of the case at the same time. Some cases may have two separate audio ports, like one on my other computers you can see here. I'll bring this audio cable underneath and up through the bottom here. Now, if you look at the audio header here, you can see that there are 9 pins. One pin is conspicuously absent, similar to the USB 3 port. And if you take a look at this connector, you can see that it is a female connector with one spot also conspicuously absent. And that makes it impossible to install the cable the wrong way, because it will only push onto the pins when the connector is turned in the correct position. And that's how you install the audio cable. So let's move on to our next section. We've got a few more cables in this bundle left to install, and 3 of these are power cables for the 3 fans here on the front of the case. Now, that means it's a good time to talk about connecting fans in general. First, let me clarify that what I'm talking about now is the power connection that will make these fans spin and move air inside the case. I'm not talking about the connection for the RGB lighting that might be inside of a fan. That's a separate issue I'll address later. Now, the great thing about most fans is that their speed can be controlled automatically, so that when the computer gets hotter, the fans can automatically run faster, so they move more air and cool the computer down appropriately. And the fans can run slower and quieter when they're not needed quite as much. Now, back here on your motherboard, you'll find fan headers scattered around in different places, providing several connection points for powering your fans. If you remember back to when we installed the CPU cooler, we connected the cooler fan to one of those headers up here at the top. Fan headers, and that's the part on the motherboard itself, usually have 4 pins. They may have only 3 pins, but most will have 4. But the fans here built into this case have these power connectors that each just have 3 holes. So is it okay to plug these 3-hole power connectors onto a 4-pin header? The answer is yes, absolutely. So these 4-pin fan headers can be used with either 3 or 4-hole fan power connectors. And in fact, if your motherboard has 3-pin headers, they will still work with fans that have 3 or 4-pin power connectors. The key to making fans work, whether they are 3-pin or 4-pin fans, and whether you are plugging into a 3 or 4-pin header, is to be sure you line up the slot on the fan's power cable with the tab on the fan header. Now, I have this old motherboard here to make it easy to demonstrate just what I'm talking about. So this is a fan that uses a 4-pin power connector, and you can see that here. But this old motherboard only has these 3-pin fan headers right here. Now, that's not a problem. This 3-pin header will work with both 3 or 4-pin fans. As long as you orient this slot that you can see here on this power cable with the tab that is on this fan header, then your fan will be plugged in correctly and it will work. Depending on the motherboard's BIOS capabilities, you may or may not be able to control the fan speed. So this fan may run at full speed only. I'll talk about BIOS later. Now, you're probably wondering what the difference is between the 3-pin and the 4-pin fans. Well, let me put one concern to rest. Both 3-pin and 4-pin fans can run at variable speeds based on computer temperature and software control or hardware controls if you have physical fan controllers. But the 4-pin fans can do it a bit better with more precise control. 3-pin fans control their speed by varying voltage, because it takes a certain amount of voltage just to get the fan moving. Think inertia here. There is a higher minimum speed for 3-pin fans. On the other hand, 4-pin fans control their speed with something called pulse width modulation, or PWM. Using PWM, the fans are turned on, always at full power, and then turned off in rapid fashion, so fast that you can't tell they are actually off. Now this happens thousands of times per second. The duration of the time that they are on versus the time they are off allows for very precise control of the fan speed. With PWM, when the fans are on, they are always at full power. With PWM fans, which are the 4-pin fans, it is possible to run at slower speeds than the 3-pin fans. So when less airflow is needed in the case, the fans can slow down and run very efficiently and quietly. PWM fans may cost just a little bit more, but they will give you a better fan experience. But let me reiterate, both 3-pin and 4-pin fans can run at variable speeds. They just accomplish it in different ways. So there is a setting on your motherboard's BIOS that you may need to adjust to make the two types of fans run correctly. Now, if you don't know what any of that means, just stick around. I will talk about BIOS later. So now I need to connect these 3 fans to the motherboard. The first thing I need to do is determine where the fan headers are located on the motherboard. And of course, this will be different on every motherboard. So check your manual if you can't find them just by a visual inspection. Now, there's 2 of the fan headers down here at the bottom. And these are officially labeled as CHA Fan 2 and CHA Fan 3. CHA Fan is just short for chassis fan, and chassis is just another word for the case itself. Now, these fan headers are intended to power the fans that you attach to your case, and these might also be labeled as sysfan on some motherboards. Then there is one right here in the middle, up here underneath the CPU cooler, so it is hard to see without really searching for it. This one is labeled chassis or CHA Fan 1. Then there is another one up here labeled AIO pump. And finally, there is one up here on the top right labeled CPU OPT, which means this is an optional CPU fan header, so you could power a second fan for your CPU cooler with this one. Now, it is possible to attach another fan to the CPU cooler on the other side here, and that's where I would plug that fan in on the CPU OPT if I did want a second fan cooling this. A common question is, can you use the optional CPU fan header to power a fan somewhere else in the case? In other words, a fan that is not a CPU cooling fan. The simple answer is yes, it's okay to connect other fans to the optional CPU fan header, but you must understand that the temperature of the CPU will control how fast the fans that connect to this header will run. As the CPU temperature rises, any fan connected to the optional CPU fan header will speed up. Of course, the temperature at which that happens and by how much that speed is increased will be controlled by any settings you make in your motherboard's BIOS settings or any optional fan software that you may be using. For this installation, I just want to stay away from using the optional CPU fan header because I just don't need it. I've got others that I can use. One other common question to answer is, can I use the AIO pump header to power a case fan? An AIO, or all-in-one, is a water cooling system for the CPU, and I'm not using one of those in this particular build. So this pump header up here would power a water pump in an AIO. You could also use it to power a fan, but depending on your motherboard's BIOS, there may not be a way to control the fan speed, so it may run at a high speed, which could be noisy. This motherboard will allow speed control for the pump header, so it would work to power and monitor a fan if needed. I will stay away from using the AIO pump header just to make things more straightforward. Before I connect these 3 fans, there's one thing I want to do. I want to add an extra fan to the case. This case only came with these 3 front fans to pull air in, but I want to have another one in the back to exhaust fan or pull air through and out the back of the case. That means that I will need to plug in a total of 4 fans. Now, if I don't want to use the AIO pump header or the optional CPU fan header, that just leaves 3 fan headers to power 4 fans. Well, what do you do if you have more fans in your computer than you have fan headers? Very simple, you add fan hubs or fan splitters. And I have a couple of options here that I will show you today. Now, this is a simple splitter here that will work with 3-pin or 4-pin fans. It will let you plug in 3 different fans into a single header. And this hub also supports 3 or 4 pin fans and will let you run up to 5 fans off a single fan header. When you use either one of these splitters, your motherboard will only report a single fan speed. In other words, if you connect all 3 of these front fans to a single splitter, they will all run at the same speed. The fans will be controlled as if they were a single fan, not as individual fans. And that's okay. I don't need for these fans to run at different speeds. There are other types of fan hubs, but I'll just demonstrate these two. So I'll talk about this 5-way splitter first. And you can see on this little board here that there are some fan names printed on the board. You can just ignore those. This splitter will supply power to any fan you plug into it, and the fan speed will be controlled by the header the splitter plugs into. To use this, I would pick one of the open fan headers on the motherboard and connect this to the header. For this build, I don't need this 5-way splitter, so I'm going to use this 3-way splitter to power the 3 front fans. I'll install this splitter down at the bottom of the case, and you can see it says chassis fan 3 and chassis fan 2. That's the labeling that's printed on the motherboard to indicate where these 2 fan headers are. And that little piece below the pins right here and right there, those are what you need to line up the little slot on the actual splitter. We're going to line that up with that little tab to make sure that this goes on the right way. And again, there's that tab. You can see roughly where that will go. And I can just bring that down and push that right on to those 4 pins. And it's installed already, ready to go. And then now what I want to do is I want to cable manage this. And so this whole bundle will go down into the basement here so that we can then route the cables to the back of the case. So I'll go ahead and push that in now. And I'll turn the computer around. And so here is our splitter, the 3 different cables that we're going to connect to. And now I can connect all 3 of these front fans to this single splitter. And it's a clean way to keep the 3 front fans installed on a single fan header. One important note about these splitters. If you look at the connectors here, you'll see that only one has 4 pins. The other 2 have just 3 pins. If you're only installing 1 or 2 fans on this splitter, be sure at least one fan is connected to this connector here that has the 4 pins. Otherwise, the fan speed will not be reported in BIOS and the fan speed controls probably won't work. Of course, because I'm plugging in all 3 fans in this connector here, this splitter, there isn't going to be a problem with this. Now, this other splitter may have a similar issue where one specific header must be connected. Otherwise, fan speeds won't be communicated with the motherboard. So check with the splitter instructions, or you may have to just experiment and see where you have to plug in at least one of the fans to get the fan speeds to be reported in BIOS. Now, I'll talk about fan speeds in the BIOS later in the video so you can see where this is reported. All right, let's connect these 3 power cables. And the first thing I did was I made sure to untangle these cables from this bundle of cables that we still have to deal with. So these are coming directly out of the front, out of these fans. And so I've made sure that they've got a straight shot down here to this newly installed splitter. And so now let's look at the splitter connectors. So you see here where these have a little tab on them, very much like what we saw on the motherboard. And so we need to make sure that marries up with, if you look at the power cable for one of the fans here that has that same old slot that you've seen a couple of times now. And so if I just make sure that marries into the tab on the connector itself and push that in, there we go. That first one is connected. And you notice there's a pin here that's actually exposed. It hasn't been connected to anything, and that's okay. We're only worried about providing power to the fan. That extra pin that provides detailed information that allows it to talk to the motherboard isn't necessary in this case. We will have, the voltage is going to be regulated and controlled, and so these fans can go up or down in speed because we still have this one connector that has the 4 pins, and actually only 3 of these are going to be connected, but that's okay. Again, the splitter here will control all 3 fan speeds. There's going to be a single speed for all 3 fans, but they will be a controlled speed, and that can go up or down. So again, let's continue connecting these into that slot, push that in, and the final one here, push that into the slot, and we've got all three of the cables installed. And so now I'm just going to set these aside, and I'll worry about cable management a little bit later. But let's move on to the next step. Now I'll install this extra case fan. This is a third-party fan that I purchased since this case did not have a fan in the back. I wanted to make sure I had at least one exhaust fan to pull hot air out of the case. So this is a 4-pin PWM or pulse width modulation fan. And there's a space for this fan right up here. And this is a 120 millimeter space, which is the size of this fan. Now, if you're not sure about fan sizes, check the documentation that came with your case. 140 millimeter and 200 millimeter fans are also very common sizes. The three fans on the front are pulling air into the case. Then the fan here on the CPU cooler is pulling air back to the back part of the case, which is right here again. So this additional fan that I'm installing will help to exhaust all of that air just out the back. Remember what we talked about before, the air enters the fan on this open side here and is exhausted out the back side where this cage is. So that would be sitting up here, something like that. But before I attach this fan, I did want to mention that most cases will have more than one place that you can attach a fan. This case is no exception. On the top of the case, on the inside up here, and then down here, but I'm going to keep it simple just by installing a single fan on the back here. And now before I attach the fan, I do need to determine where I'm going to actually plug it in to get electricity. This fan has a nice long power cable here, you can see, and I could easily attach this to one of the fan headers just by letting it sit out here in the case and go directly to the fan header. But for the sake of keeping the case looking clean and for airflow, I do want to hide the wire if at all possible. So there are all kinds of ways that I can do this. I could route the wire up along the top of the case through the hole in the back and bring it behind the board and back into the case, and then connect to the optional CPU header or the AIO pump header that we talked about previously. But I already decided to stay away from plugging into those. So the next thing I could do is I could bring the wire down along the front, attach here, and bring the wire down this way, and then actually go underneath the PSU shroud on top of the power supply and up and connect it here. Or I could bring the cable up here and drop it down behind this motherboard heatsink, and then come out down here and connect to this other chassis header right here in the middle. But I don't really want to connect a cable that way. It shouldn't be an issue to do that, but I just have other options that I think are going to be easier. So I will bring the cable up here and behind the motherboard, and on the back side you can see this cable almost makes it down here where I could attach this to the fan header on the bottom of the motherboard, but not quite. So I do happen to have some fan power cable extensions, and so what I'm going to do is attach this to the cable here, and then this will attach to the motherboard header itself. But if you don't have an extension like this, I do encourage you to find a practical solution route for the cable. If you aren't too concerned about the look of the inside of your PC, then you can just run the power cable directly to any of the fan headers, and this one little cable won't kill the airflow in your case. Before I attach the power cable to the header, I need to install the fan in the case. You should be able to mount your fan in 4 different positions. It's square, so you can turn this in any direction that puts your power cable where it needs to be closest to whichever header you choose. Now, the 4 holes on the corners are where I will attach the fan to the case with these screws that were included with the fan. Now, if you look closely at the holes where the screws will go, you'll see that there are no threads in the plastic on the fan. This is normal for case fans. These fans come with self-tapping screws, meaning that the screws are designed to cut their own threads the first time you screw them in. Unlike the hard drive screws and the solid state drive screws I talked about earlier, where you do not want to feel any resistance when screwing them in, with these fan screws you absolutely will feel resistance the first time you screw them in. That's normal because you are cutting the threads into the plastic. Your case may have 4 holes on the back here, so it's very obvious where you insert the screws, or like this case, you may find these slots, and I can position the fan anywhere along these vertical slots, and that can be helpful if other items that you install in the case are in the way. I'll take the first screw and insert that in the top here and start screwing that in. It can be a little difficult to get these started since there are no threads in the hole, so you may need to apply just a little bit of pressure as you start the screw just to make it bite into the plastic. Then I'll start the next screw on the opposite corner down here and just get that started so it will stay in. Then I'll insert the 2 remaining screws and just get them started. And finally, I'll crisscross and tighten all 4 screws down evenly. Don't over tighten the screws or you can strip the holes. And now that all the screws are in, I can go ahead and attach the extension cable to the fan cable itself. And now I can bring this up through the back and bring that underneath. And here's that cable right here. I just need to turn it around so it can now attach to the fan header that you see right here. All right, so I've got the cable attached to the header, so that means that our fan is officially plugged in. It's installed on the case. It should be working just fine. Once we turn this on, we'll test it when we first turn it on. But that's it for installing the fans. Let's move on to the next step. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I would not be installing any RGB lighting in this computer. However, because the fans that are included with this case here do have RGB lighting, I might as well make the simple connection that will allow those fans lights to work. Now, that gives me the opportunity also to cover the basics of RGB lighting for you. Now, a full tutorial on RGB lighting is just beyond the scope of this video, but I will show you just a few things to get you started. This case has 4 cables related to RGB lighting, and I'll talk about each cable. The first cable comes from the factory already installed, so I don't have to do anything with this one, but I will explain what it does. This cable is connected to the RGB lighting on all 3 of the front fans. You can see there are 3 connectors on this single cable. This cable delivers the power for the RGB lighting as well as the signal, which tells the lights what to do. In other words, what color the various lights should be, when they should be on, and their intensity and so forth. Now this connects to the RGB controller that is built into the top of this case up here. This controller allows the lights to work and to provide different effects. Now, I could disconnect any one of these 3 cables and the lighting in that fan would stop working. However, the fan itself would continue to spin because, remember, the fan is powered with the other power cables that we looked at earlier. The fan power and the RGB lighting power are totally separate from each other. So that leaves these 3 other cables. Now only one of these cables must be connected for the lighting to work, and that is this SATA power connector. This connects to the RGB controller up here, and this cable provides power to make the fans light up. And for these RGB lights to work, this cable must be plugged into the computer's power supply. More about that in just a moment. The third RGB lighting cable is this 3-pin female connector. This is optional. It does not have to be plugged in for the lights to work in this case. This is an ARGB or addressable RGB connector that will plug into a header on the motherboard. Now this allows the motherboard and any software I might install to connect to the RGB controller and control the fan lights as well as any other lights I might install in the case. The fourth cable, which is also optional and which I will not be connecting, is a 3-pin male connector. You can see that here if I take this little cover off. I could use this to connect to something like an RGB strip, but I will not be using that. Now the RGB controller up here is connected to 2 buttons on the top of the case that will allow me to change the fan color and the mode for the lights. The mode is just a preset that makes the lights move or change in a pre-programmed way. Let's talk about this third cable, the ARGB connector. This is a 5-volt 3-pin connector. Now my motherboard, and probably yours too, has 2 types of RGB headers. Be careful if yours does, since they do provide different voltages and can damage or destroy lights and devices if you plug into the wrong header. This 4-pin header provides 12 volts. These are typically for LED strips. These only allow you to have a single color at a time on a strip. The 3-pin headers provide 5 volts and they allow individual LEDs to be addressed. So a single strip of lights could have multiple colors simultaneously. Thus, 3-pin headers are called addressable RGB headers because they can address individual lights. 1 pin provides power, 1 is ground, and the 3rd pin provides data that tells the device how each LED should be lit. Be sure you only plug 3-pin cables onto 3-pin headers and only plug 4-pin cables onto 4-pin headers. As I mentioned earlier, I only need to plug in the SATA power cable to make these fan lights work. However, if I wanted to allow the motherboard and any connected software and or RGB controllers to control the fan lights, I would need to connect this ARGB cable to the motherboard. And for this build, it's not something I need, but while I'm here, I might as well go ahead and connect this cable to the motherboard header. In the future, if I do decide to set up additional lights or do some RGB control through the motherboard, I'll already be set. This motherboard has 3 of the ARGB headers. That's the 3-pin header. So 2 are down here and 1 is right here. On my motherboard, these are right next to the 4-pin 12-volt header. So do look carefully at your motherboard's RGB headers and make sure you connect to the right one. I'll bring this ARGB cable through the back here and connect it to the 3-pin ARGB header at the top. So that takes me back to this SATA power cable. Now, if you recall, I did not install a SATA power cable in this computer connected to the power supply unit because I didn't install any solid-state drives or hard drives that required SATA power. But I will need SATA power for this RGB lighting cable. So that means I need to add 1 more power cable to the power supply. I can try to squeeze this SATA power cable into the case right here and connect that to the back of this power supply. But if that's too difficult, just remove the 4 screws from the power supply and shift the power supply around so that you can get the cable in and plug it into the power supply. Then screw the 4 screws back on and you're good to go. Then attach the RGB power connector to the SATA power cable. And that's it for getting the very simple 3-fan RGB lighting working on this computer. And let's move on to the next step. Although I'm not installing a graphics processing unit or GPU like this one in this build, I promise to show you how to do that, since most people will probably install a GPU. Now, I did save this as the last piece of equipment to install because these cards are so big that they would just get in the way of all the other stuff that we have to install if we did this earlier in the process. So I recommend you install these last. Now, most graphics cards are installed horizontally directly into the slot on the motherboard. That's like this. But with the proper add-on device, it is possible to install a GPU vertically, sort of like that, or down like that. Now, I will demonstrate the traditional method for this particular build. This top expansion slot that you can see right here is the normal place for installing your GPU, and that's because this slot typically has the most PCIe lanes, and that's normally 16 lanes, and the lanes will be the fastest that your system has to offer. Now, a lane is a channel for data to travel on, and the more lanes that are available to a slot, like the one that this GPU will be installed in, typically that means the higher the available bandwidth, and thus the speed at which the data from this GPU can be transferred to the motherboard and the rest of the computer. Now, because a GPU is processing a large amount of data, you really want this plugged into a slot with the most available PCIe lanes. So check your motherboard's manual for more information about how many PCIe lanes are allocated among the slots and other devices in your motherboard. Now, before installation, you should push down this retention clip. You can hear that click when you push that down, and just make sure that's pushed down so it's ready to receive the GPU when we put it in. Next, anytime you install an expansion card or device like this GPU into one of the slots here, you normally have to attach this to the case so it doesn't move. Now, on the back of the case, you'll find these slot covers, and most of the time these are attached with a screw, and you can see here on the inside of the case there are screws where these slot covers are attached. Sometimes you'll find that these slot covers are actually pieces of metal that are physically attached to the case. They're part of the case, and you actually have to break those off or fatigue them until they break off, but that is not really common these days. So most of the time you're going to actually have a screw where you will remove that. Now, these big modern GPUs normally use two slot covers, so the card itself will only plug into a single slot on the motherboard, but the housing is so thick it actually takes up the space of two slots. What you need to do is determine which of these slot covers will be occupied when you install the GPU and just remove those slot covers. I'll hold this motherboard interface connector, that's this part right here, over the slot where I will install the card. And you can see there are two slot covers right here and here that I will need to remove. And notice there's actually one above this where the graphics card will sit that does not need to be removed. Oftentimes these thumb screws come from the factory very tight, and so you may need a screwdriver the first time you use them to get them loose. Now, I've got this big screwdriver here, but sometimes these things are so thick that you can't actually get a good angle on the screw. So one of the things I would suggest is I've got this little screwdriver that came with my bit kit, and it has a neat little trick that you can do with it. Pull down on this like that, and then pull up on this main shaft. This actually will pull out and it will lock into place. You can pull it all the way out, but if you can just lock it right there, then now I have a screwdriver that is long and can get the right angle on these thumb screws to come out. I'll unscrew those, remove those slot covers, and then just save those with all the other unused parts from this case. Before inserting the card, there's probably a couple of things that you will need to remove from the card itself. Now, if I look here at this motherboard interface, there is a little cover here that I will need to remove. Be sure to remove that or it won't go in the slot, and actually it might even damage the slot if you try to do that. Then check to see if the card has protective film on it. Now, this one has a bunch. Nearly every surface is covered with protective film. Sometimes it can be hard to see, so look very carefully and get it off. There's even some here on the hub of each fan, so you want to make sure you get that off. The last thing you want is some plastic getting stuck in a fan or a heat sink where it could cause overheating. That's it for the peeling. Just before you install this card, especially if it's a really large card, one thing you should check for are obstructions, and that could be a number of things, anything from a wire to a piece of the case. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to hold this up here and just push this roughly where it needs to go. And so I can see I actually have a problem here. This wire is a little bit in the way. That should be no problem to remove that or push that out of the way. But this piece right here is actually something that can be removed and turned around and face in the other direction. And so I'm going to have to remove that or take it out and turn it around. And so let me do that real quick, and then I can continue installing this. Well, you can see in my hand I have this piece that I took out of the case. I tried turning this around, and this card is so big. This is a 4070 graphics card, and it's so long that even turned around, this metal piece was still in the way. I'm not interested in trying to cut a notch in this piece, so I'm simply just taking this out. And so you can see inside here now I have this big open hole, and I don't care. Again, this is not meant for a beautiful build. This is a computer built for me, and this is fine. And actually, you know, I'm putting this in temporarily for this demonstration, and this will come out, and so I can put this back in. So one thing to think about, one lesson to learn from this issue with this case is you may need to check, if you get a really large graphics card, check the obstructions before you do anything else in your case. Check those, make sure it's going to fit. Or you may have to remove something like this, or you may even have a case that just isn't big enough to work with this size card. So lesson learned, and so I'm going to move on now. And what I'm going to do next is I'll carefully push this GPU in here into the slot and make sure the retention clip is pushed down before you insert the GPU. And you need to make sure that if you have these little prongs here, they do need to go into, there's a slot inside the case, and so I need to make sure those go into those two slots. Otherwise, I won't be able to get the card in. So I just guide that into those slots, and now I can finally push the card in. And when that goes into the slot, normally that retention clip will click into place, and you may or may not hear it click. So you just have to sort of watch and make sure you see it actually click into place, and you could see that just now. And now I'll take these two screws that I removed from the slots and screw the GPU onto the case so it is secure. Next, you'll probably have power cables that you need to connect to the GPU. Now remember, we covered this when talking about the power supply, but be sure to use separate cables, 2 cables, or 3 if you have multiple power ports to connect to on the GPU. This card includes a power cable that connects to the single port on the card itself, and you can see it will be ready to receive the 2 power cables we installed earlier. So I'll connect that to the card right now. And I made sure that snugly fit there on the card. You don't want to have that partially in. You need to make sure it's absolutely all the way in. So I've got the 2 power cables, and I can just route or push both of those through right here. And now I'll rotate this around. So now I just need to connect the power cables to this adapter here that I just installed. And remember, you've got these 6+2 power connectors coming out of the PSU, and so I just need to put those together. And let me get the other one here. Now if I was actually installing this, I would really be concerned about the route that this is taking, and of course you want to be as well. And there we go. So that's it. I have these installed the way I need them. I could bring these cables down through here rather than back this way. So a couple of choices on how you could do that in your particular case. Now, one thing to mention about these crazy big graphics cards, they can start to sag because you can see how big it is, how far it might sit down. So you may want to consider getting a bracket that supports the GPU here. Now this GPU included this simple little adjustable stand that is magnetic here on the bottom. So I can just make this adjustable height here. This goes up and down, even comes out, and there's a screwdriver if you turn it around that way. but so I can set that down there with the magnet. It will stay in place, and just make adjustments until I've got this at the proper height, and roughly something like that. This one doesn't need a whole lot, but that would support this, especially as it gets older. It's going to sag more, and so you could make any adjustments needed to push that back up. There are other brackets available. Some may come with your case or may be optional to work with your case. So just check your case manufacturer and see maybe they have something that will help you support these big cards. And so that's how you install a GPU. And since this card is not actually being used in this computer, I'm going to remove it, and then I'm going to move on to the next step. We've finished installing all of the parts and cables in this computer, and this is the mess that we're left with. And this isn't that bad, really, because this computer does not have as many parts and fans and lights that other computers may have. But it is still a jumbled mess of wires that I need to tame before completing the build. And that's where cable management comes in. Now, the simplest way to describe cable management is that you are organizing your cables. There are two main reasons why you might want to organize your cables. Number one is just to maximize the airflow within the case. And two is to improve the aesthetic of your computer. It's just nice when your computer looks clean and uncluttered. Now, a side benefit of all this cable organizing is that working on or updating your computer in the future should be easier when your cables are carefully managed. Cable management is really more art than science, in my opinion. If you don't do it perfectly, the PC police are not coming to arrest you. So just don't worry about it. Now, if you're building this computer for yourself, you can do as little or as much cable management as you like, and your computer will almost certainly function properly. With today's modern computer cases, the majority of cables are on the back side here of the case. Very little of the wiring is on the front public side, so the focus of cable management is just organizing and hiding cables on this side of the case. Almost nobody's going to see it, so it does not have to be pristine. One challenge of demonstrating cable management is that every case is different, so just spend some time learning what your case has to offer for cable management. So when you're staring at this mess of wires, where do you begin? Well, I say begin with the idea that your cables do not have to be perfect, so just relax. Then pick something big to organize first. Get the physically large cables out of the way first, and that'll make it easier to organize the smaller, thinner cables later. Now, one thing I want to do is take some pressure off of this big motherboard power cable. It's heavy and it pulls itself down just because of its own weight, and it's not a big problem, but I might as well remove some of that downward pressure from this motherboard where I can just lift this up. So I want to raise this and some of the other cables that are attached to the motherboard nearby. So on the back side, I can just grab all of these. If I can just lift that up, this case came with this tie here installed, but I need to move it to the other side, and then I can strap these in and hold this up. Next, I want to bundle this same batch of cables down below here so they take up less space and can't get loose and in the way. So you can bundle cables in a number of different ways. This case comes with a small supply of zip ties, and I'm sure you've seen zip ties like this. You know what they are. But I could easily just put these on here. And I can start to bundle the cables that way, and you might want to leave these loose as you first put them on so you can make slight adjustments later. Now, zip ties are quick and easy, and they do provide a very secure way for managing cables, but they are one-time use only. If you bundle some cables and then you later need to make some changes to that, you're going to have to cut the tie and then discard it. So that's why I also like to use Velcro straps, and I have these big rolls of Velcro in black or white, and these can be cut to any length. So if I wanted to pull that out, if I needed one that long, I could certainly do that. Now these can be a little cumbersome to work with, but if you need to reposition cables, you just loosen the Velcro and make the change. I also like this type of Velcro strap. These come in specific lengths, and they have this hole here that lets you create a more secure strap than these plain strips of Velcro. And this is a big block of these. They have 4 different sizes here. There's, I don't know how many there are in this block, but check the description for links to these and other tools that you see in this video. Now, if you're using zip ties, you will need some clippers to cut the ends off when you're finished, or just to clip these if you have to remove one. So just be careful not to cut a wire. So I'll go ahead now and bundle these up. So what's next? Well, one thing I can do is hide these GPU power cables that I installed earlier. I installed them so I could demonstrate the installation of a GPU, but I'm not keeping the GPU installed. So these cables are here. They're unattached to anything except the power supply itself. Now I will leave them in because I may eventually install a GPU in this computer, but I would recommend removing any unused cables from your computer. So I can hide these cables down here. I could put them in here behind the power supply, but space is a little tight there. So I think I'll bring these around over here. And I can put some Velcro straps around these just to keep them a little more organized, especially these little pigtails that can get a little bit cumbersome. The big part of cable management a lot of times is just hiding excess cable, finding places where you can put it. One thing that can happen as you're installing the various parts and cables is that cables get twisted up a bit. For example, this fan cable would be better if it was behind these other wires. I could manage the cable better. So what I'm going to do is detach this and bring this behind these other cables and then reattach that. And that makes it easier now. I can bring this over here to the side, and I'll attach it with some of the hooks that are on here as well. And the same is true of this audio cable that's connected to the motherboard and also up to the audio port on the case. It's just a little bit out here. It could be managed a little better. And so I could detach that from the motherboard and route the cable a little better and then reattach it to the motherboard. So just be prepared to detach and reattach some cables as you go through the cable management process. The rest of these cables just need to be bundled together, and I could strap them to one or more of the hooks that are built into the case. So I'll go ahead and do that now. So I got those ready to go. Maybe not the most beautiful bundling in the world, but I'm happy with it. I'm good with it. So what I can do now is install this cover plate, and one thing you have to watch out for is bundling too many cables together so that they are too thick and you can't even get a cover plate like this on, or maybe even the case itself, the back part, you may not be able to get it on if you've bundled things too thick. So you have to watch out for that. That was easy enough to get that plate on there. You can see that makes the whole back part look pretty clean. And here's the front side. You can see obviously it looks very clean. Almost no wires to speak of here. Just a little bit up here, a few down here, and that's it. So very clean. And that was a very simple process because this build was relatively simple. Now with your computer, just take your time. Do the best you can, and don't worry if it doesn't look perfect. You can always revisit your cables and work on it more later. And that's it. Let's move to the next step. I know you're probably dying to turn your computer on, but before that happens, there are a few things that you need to do. First, you need to grab the power cable that came with your power supply and plug that into the back of the computer, and then plug that into a power outlet. Then make sure the switch on the outside of the power supply is switched to the on position, and that's this line here that looks like a 1. Make sure that's switched to that side. That has to be on before the computer will power on at all. Next, you need to set up a monitor. I've got mine right here, and connect it to your computer. Note that if you installed a GPU, be sure to plug in the video cable from your monitor to one of the ports on the GPU, not on the motherboard. Otherwise, you will not be getting the video from your graphics card you paid so much money for. In my case, I did not install a graphics card, so I'm just plugging this HDMI cable here into the HDMI port built into the motherboard itself, and that's right up here. So make sure you plug into the right place. Now you may have something other than HDMI to plug in. It may be DisplayPort, or it might even be VGA if you have an older monitor. Next, I'll plug in a mouse, and I've got a little wireless mouse here, and I also have this little wireless receiver or dongle. I can plug that into any USB port. Now there is no software to install to make this particular wireless mouse work, so it should work immediately when I turn it on. If you turn on your computer and the mouse is not working, it could be because the mouse requires the installation of some software, but that's pretty rare. So just try another mouse, such as a wired mouse, until you can get your operating system running. Then you can install the necessary mouse software. So I'll plug this in here. Just pick any one of these USB ports, and it never goes in the right way the first time. You always have to turn it around. All right. And finally, you need to plug in your keyboard. I've got a keyboard right here, and this is a wired keyboard. And you may have a similar problem trying to get a wireless keyboard to work initially, so you may need to use a wired keyboard just in the beginning. And so I'm going to plug that in. Also, plug this in to just pick a USB port. Hey, it went in the right way the first time. On this particular motherboard, I have a port here. It's this round port. Right there, you can see that is called a PS2 port. Very old technology. It's been around for decades, literally. So if you have some very old keyboards or an older mouse, you might be able to plug into that if you need to have a wired keyboard or mouse to get your computer going. So now you're ready to turn your computer on and fire this thing up. Okay, the computer is all built. It's all hooked up to monitors and keyboards and mices, and can't we just turn it on already? Just one more thing. Let's talk about BIOS for just a moment. So BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System. You can think of this as an operating system like Windows that is just built into your motherboard. But this operating system is very simple or basic, thus the first letter in BIOS. Now when you turn on a computer, it has to have a way to do some very basic things like verify what equipment is connected to the motherboard and make sure everything is working properly and talking back and forth. Now the old traditional BIOS has actually been replaced by something called Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, or UEFI, in newer motherboards. But UEFI is still referenced as BIOS by most people, and even on motherboard manufacturer sites, software updates for UEFI are listed under the category BIOS. BIOS and UEFI mostly do the same thing, but UEFI just does it better. Now this is not an in-depth look at the two, but just know that if you see a basic looking text-based interface when you look at BIOS on your computer, it is probably running the old BIOS. And if you see a more graphical interface that can be controlled with the mouse, that is probably UEFI. Now in this video, I'm not talking in depth about BIOS or UEFI, but I just want to make sure you are aware that this even exists on a computer, because you will probably need to make some changes in BIOS or UEFI when you're setting up or modifying your computer in the future. Okay, enough talking. Let's boot this thing. So I'll press the power button up here on the top. And that's good. The light around the power button tells me I correctly connected to the system panel power LED header And that beep I just heard tells me things are sounding and looking good as well. Now first, I want to be certain the fan on the CPU cooler is spinning, so I'll take a look. And it is spinning, so I don't want the CPU to overheat. So make sure any CPU cooling fans you installed are actually spinning. And as you can see on the front, the fans here are spinning and the RGB lights are working as well. And the additional case fan I installed is also spinning. So it appears that all fans are working. And so now on the screen here, you can see the UEFI. And this interface will give you access to the basic hardware installed on this computer and control how the computer uses the installed parts. And this is where you tweak settings related to your RAM and disk drives and other things. Now earlier in the video I promised to talk about fans in the BIOS, so I'm going to do that now. You can see the 3 fan headers here that we plugged the 5 different fans into, and you can see the different speeds at which those fans are running, and these get updated in real time. As the computer temperature rises or falls, these speeds will rise or fall as well. Now I can control the fan speeds using Q fan control, and your motherboard will likely call it something different. So let's click on that and go into that and take a look at what that means. So you can see the different fan headers that are on this motherboard, and what you see here are some profiles of how we want the fans to behave based on the temperature. So on this x-axis here, you can see this is Celsius, and on the y-axis here, this is the percentage of the fan's speed. In other words, at 0, it's not running. At 100%, it is running as fast as that particular fan can go. And so this profile tells the computer how you want it to handle the fan speed based on the temperature of, right now it's on CPU fan. So in other words, as the temperature rises, as it gets to somewhere here below 30, probably 20 degrees Celsius, that means the fan is going to be running at 20% of its capacity. And then once it hits this point, it will start to ramp up and get a little bit faster. And eventually, when it hits 70 degrees, that fan would be running as fast as it possibly could. And so one of the things that we can do is we can choose a different profile that is automatically programmed into this motherboard. So I could hit on silent. And so that will allow this thing to get a little bit hotter before it really ramps up the fan speed. Turbo is going to be a slightly different version of that. Full speed is just going to make this thing come on. Even at 0 degrees, it's going to run at 100%. And I can hear right now the fan on that CPU cooler is running much faster. And in fact, if I exit out of this, I can see that CPU fan, which was running in the 600 RPMs, now it's running at 1800 and something. So that really changed the fan speed for that CPU fan. So I can just set that back to standard, and that will make it slow down, and it won't be quite as loud. But one other thing you can do is you can actually set a manual fan speed, and you have these different points on this graph, and you can adjust those. You can even see the exact temperature and the percentage fan power duty, as they call it. And so if you wanted to make sure that your CPU didn't overheat, if you're having troubles, or if it's running too fast and it's making too much noise, you could come in here and create your own fan profile. And so that's available to set on any of the different fan headers on this computer, and even on the AIO pump. If you had one of those installed, you can control that. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'll set this back to standard on the CPU. Now one of the other things I mentioned in talking about fans earlier was the two different types of fans, the kind that is the PWM, the pulse width modulation, as well as the other types of fans that vary the speed by the amount of voltage that is applied to that fan. And so this is where you would tell the computer or the motherboard what type of fan is installed on that particular header. And so up here, this little drop down shows you have DC mode. That's the kind, that's the 3-pin fans that are controlled by the voltage, and then the PWM, the 4-pin fans. So if you knew that you had one particular fan installed on a particular header, you could go ahead and set that. But You can also set it on auto detect, and most of the time the motherboards will be able to determine what kind of fan it is and properly regulate the speed of the fan. Now, by the way, when you first boot your computer, as long as you don't have Windows or another operating system installed on your boot drive, or you don't have an installation USB stick or a DVD somewhere in your computer, then your computer should automatically start up BIOS or UEFI, bringing you to a page like this one. However, once you have installed your operating system, the computer will normally boot directly into that operating system. So when you need to get back to BIOS or UEFI, you will need to repeatedly press a key immediately after you press the power button on your computer. Now, typically the key to press is the delete or del key, or it might be the F2 key on your computer. Your system will probably show you when you first boot up the key that you need to press to do that. And this motherboard will actually work with either F2 or the delete key. Okay, so let's talk about this screen here, the screen on the UEFI. Your computer interface is probably going to look something similar to this, but it probably will not be exactly the same. Every motherboard and manufacturer will have their own version of UEFI, but they will all provide access to the same things, such as CPU temperature, fan speeds, overclocking, RAM settings, boot devices, disk drives, plus more. Now, this is an ASUS motherboard, so if you have one as well, your interface is going to look similar to this one. But again, at the end of the day, no matter the manufacturer, these interfaces have to provide similar capabilities because they're dealing with the low level or nuts and bolts of what is installed in a computer, making those components work together. And I can see the temperature of my CPU, and this is being updated as the temperature changes. The temperature looks pretty good, so I'm assured that I installed the CPU cooler correctly. I would say 30 degrees to 70 degrees Celsius is an acceptable range for a CPU, but they can go higher than that when they're under load. Of course, the lower the better. Now, the NVMe drive that I installed, you can see that right here, and that seems to be installed correctly. And if you install more than one drive, you should see them here. If not, you'll need to check the data and power connections for those drives. And this shows 2 sticks of RAM, both 16 gigabytes. You can see the total memory here, and it shows the speed at which those are currently running. And you can see the CPU that I installed right up here. I'm currently running this in easy mode, so there's not much I can do from this screen. So I'm going to switch to advanced mode. I can either click down here or press F7. And now you can see many more options for configuring your hardware. Out of the box, most motherboards are configured how you need them, but this is where you would make changes if necessary. A deeper look into your BIOS is, of course, beyond the scope of this video, but if you have some free time, take a look around here at the options. If you just need a simple dashboard view, the easy mode gives me the information I need, so I'm just going to switch back to easy mode here. Before I do anything else, I want to update the BIOS firmware on this motherboard. Now up here, you can see the BIOS version that is installed on this motherboard. It's currently version 14.02. And just like Windows gets regular updates, BIOS does as well. These updates provide security fixes, hardware compatibility updates, especially regarding RAM compatibility, as well as new CPUs when those are released. Because new hardware is constantly being released, the BIOS has to be updated so the motherboard can work with that hardware. It's possible that your RAM or even your CPU won't work properly in your motherboard until you update BIOS. So I would recommend updating your BIOS before you install Windows or whatever other operating system you plan to use. Also, you may know that one of the common things to enable in BIOS is the XMP or extreme memory profile, and you can see that right here, and you can see that it is currently disabled. Now I could click on that and enable it, but I don't want to do that yet. If you're running a motherboard that uses an AMD processor, this is called EXPO. Now turning this on will allow your motherboard to utilize your RAM at faster rates. However, don't change it until after you update your BIOS and after you install Windows. That way, if there are any compatibility issues between your motherboard and your RAM, hopefully the BIOS update will fix that and your operating system installation will go smoothly. So to get an update for your BIOS, you will need another computer that you can use to go online and download the update file. I've got my laptop here for that purpose, and finding this update should be fairly simple. Just search for your motherboard's model name and be as precise as you can when searching. Now you can see the name of this motherboard here in BIOS is the ASUS Prime Z790P Wi-Fi. Or I can look at the box that it came in or the manual that came with the motherboard. On my laptop, I'll search for that name but add the word BIOS. Now I'll try this first search result here, click on that, and that took me to the exact page where I can download the file here. Now if you aren't so lucky, just look for words on this page or whatever page you come to, words like downloads or BIOS updates or firmware. This shows the most recent BIOS update, and this was updated a little over a month ago based on the date here. There are other BIOS updates available if I need a specific version of the BIOS, but I'm curious how old the current BIOS on my motherboard is. I'll click down here to show all, and as I scroll down here, I can find that 1402 update, and there it is. I can see that the 1402 BIOS update was released in September of last year. So I'm making this in late May. So this BIOS is at least 8 months old. So you can see all of these BIOS updates that have been released since the motherboard was made. So my BIOS is definitely in need of an update. To install this update, I'll need an empty USB drive like this one. I can plug this into any port on my laptop. And I'll click to download the update. And it's completely downloaded. Then just click up here to see the file. And this is a zip file, so I'll double click on that and I can just extract all. And I can extract this directly to the thumb drive that I just installed. And that's the thumb drive right there, PNY. So click on that, select folder, and click extract. And so now there's my PNY USB drive and the two files that are in there. I only need this file, I don't need this file renamer, so I'll right click on that and just hit the trash can and get rid of that. If you have any subdirectories or folders on this USB drive, for your best results, you should copy the install file to the root of the USB drive. In other words, do not copy it to a subdirectory, since some motherboards may require that the file not be in a subdirectory. Once I have that file on this USB drive, I'll remove it from my laptop. Now, if you want to be safe, don't just yank this drive out. Instead, if you go into File Explorer and you right-click and then click Eject, then you can physically remove it from the computer. And that just prevents any files from being corrupted if they are still open or still being transferred. So I can pull that out now. Next, I'll insert this USB drive into any USB port on the new computer. I'll just use one of the ports on the top of the case here. Now remember, this is an ASUS motherboard, so this procedure will be slightly different if your motherboard is a different brand. So check instructions for your hardware. Now right now I'm in the easy mode. You can tell that because it says easy mode at the top. So I need to go to the advanced mode down here. If I click on this or just press F7 and then come up here and click on Tool. Then click on ASUS Easy Flash 3 Utility. And if you have a drive plugged in, you would see information about that. This is the PNY flash drive that I plugged in, and you can see the files that are on that drive. And there is the single BIOS update file that I installed on that drive. And it says, do you want to read this file? And I will say yes. And it's going to verify that I really want to do this. It does show you some information about the file, which version number it is, the date of that file. And I'm ready to do that, so I'll say yes. And so now it will start to do the update. You can see it is doing some things down here on the bottom. I can no longer move my mouse, but it is processing. Now, do not interrupt the process. your computer may reboot several times and it may seem like it's stuck. So just let it go and do not turn it off. It is possible to mess up a motherboard if you lose power or turn it off during this type of upgrade, although many motherboards now have a way to recover if that happens. But your best bet is to not do this during an electrical storm, so you aren't worrying that your power will go out. Now, if you happen to have an uninterruptible power supply, consider plugging into that while doing this update. Okay, well that took about 7 minutes, but I have seen much longer update times, so be patient. Now, when this update finished, this computer booted back into the UEFI or BIOS screen that I have been working in previously. However, after your BIOS is updated, your computer may boot up to a message that requires you to press a key to finish the process. So just be aware that that might happen. And you can see here in the BIOS, the version number is no longer 1402, and it is instead showing 1656 as expected. So the update was successful. So it's okay now to pull the USB drive out of the computer. And now we're ready to install Windows. On this new computer, I'll be installing the Windows 11 operating system. So that's what I'll be demonstrating here. But if you plan to install a different operating system, you'll need to find instructions for that system. Now, there are several ways you can acquire Windows 11. If you purchased a physical box that included a flash drive or a DVD, you can just follow the instructions that are included in your box. Or you can legally download the program from Microsoft's site and then use a 25-digit product key that you will need to purchase to activate the software, either now or at a later time. Just like with downloading the BIOS update, you'll need to do these next steps from a working computer with access to the internet. So I've got my laptop here, back on that. I'm on Microsoft's website. This is the page where you can download Windows. I'll have a link to this page in the description. There are 3 different options on this page. I'm using the second option to download the files necessary to install Windows 11 on this new PC. You can use this tool to get the software prior to purchasing a Windows key. So I'll click on Download Now. And you can see this will immediately download a relatively small file. This is not the Windows installation file. Instead, this is a media creation tool that you need to run. And then this tool will then download the actual Windows installation files and make a USB drive or a DVD from which you can install Windows. So I'm going to plug my USB drive back into my laptop because I'll need it for the next step. In whatever browser you use to download the file, you just need to click on the downloaded file. So I'll click up here and click on the file itself. Alternatively, you can use File Explorer to go to your Downloads folder, and you should find the file right there, and you could double click it there as well. So back in my browser, I'll just click here and click on that. And you may see a warning like this. You can just click on Yes. And next, this window will open, and you'll need to have your team of lawyers carefully examine the terms for the media creation tool software. So you can scroll through that and read those terms, click Accept. Then the program will do some thinking for a while. Then you will see this option to select your language and edition. The program tries to determine your correct options, but if you need to make changes, just uncheck. Use the recommended options for this PC, and you could make choices based on where you might actually be if this gets it wrong. And I'll click Next. Next, you'll choose the media you want to use to install Windows. I'm using a flash drive, and that is already selected. You can see it tells you the drive must be at least 8 gigabytes. Mine is 256 gigabytes, so it is more than big enough. Now, proceed with caution here because any files that you have on this flash drive will be erased during this process. So make sure you copy any important files off this drive before you do this. Now, I just have the BIOS upgrade file that we used earlier on this drive, and I'm done using that. So I'm fine using this drive as is. Now, the other option here is ISO file, and this would be if you plan to burn the installation file to a DVD. I'm not doing that, and I'm assuming you are not, so I will just click Next. Now, on this page, you'll see a list of any USB flash drives you have plugged in. You may see some regular drives that are installed in your computer on this list, so make certain that you know what drive is the USB flash drive that you actually want to use. Otherwise, you could accidentally erase a drive in your computer. And you can see it does warn you that the files on the USB drive will be deleted. The PNY drive is my flash drive, so that's the only one option on this case. And so I'll just click Next. And the files will begin downloading from the Microsoft website. Now, depending on your internet speed, this may take just a couple of minutes or it could take longer. I sped this up 20 times normal speed. This only took about 2.5 minutes to download, but I am on a pretty fast connection. All right, so downloading is now complete and it's going to verify that the files are good. Then the program will format your USB drive and begin copying the files to that drive. I've sped this up 30 times normal speed. This took about 6.5 minutes to prepare the USB drive. All right, after a few minutes, the process will finish and you'll see a message that says your USB flash drive is ready. Now I will click Finish. And it just does a little cleanup. Now, if you look at the drive in File Explorer, so I'll click on File Explorer and find the drive here. You can see drive F. It now is ESD-USB, and this stands for Electronic Software Delivery. One thing I should point out, the Media Creation tool formats this drive, and in the process, it can reduce the available space on the drive. So if I right-click on that drive and click on Properties, you can see now that this drive shows that it's basically a 32 gigabyte capacity. But remember, this was a 256 gigabyte drive. So what happened? Well, if this has happened to your USB drive, don't worry, it's easy to fix it. I will be making a short video that shows how to fix this, and you can just click up here or check the description for a link to that video when it is actually published. Okay, so let's continue here. Just right-click on this and click Eject, or you can just pull the drive, assuming the media creation process has finished successfully. So I'll pull that out. Now you're ready to insert the flash drive into a USB port on the new computer. So I'll go ahead and do that. And if your new computer is still on, go ahead and shut it off. And you should be able to do that just by holding the power button down until it turns off. Now just press the power button to turn it back on again. And if all goes well, the motherboard should go through the normal startup process, but this time it will find the USB drive that we plugged in and see the files on that drive and boot from those files into the installation program for Windows. Once you boot up, you will see this Windows setup screen, and you can make any changes to these options here as you see fit. And if you're good with those, just click the Next button and then Install Now. If you have a Windows product key, you can go ahead and enter it here, but if you don't have a key, if you're going to get one later, or if you just want to do it later, you can just simply click down here. I don't have a product key, so that's what I will do. And then you can choose the type of operating system that you want. I'm going to choose Windows 11 Pro and click Next. Whoa, now hold on. This PC can't run Windows. Don't panic if you get a message like this. There are probably some settings you will need to change in your BIOS. Recent versions of Windows require hardware on the motherboard called Trusted Platform Module, or TPM, and this hardware enhances security. Now, requiring TPM on motherboards has made some older computers impossible to upgrade to Windows 11. But this is a new motherboard, and I am 100% certain it is compatible based on the specs from ASUS. So here's how to fix this. First, I'll pull this USB drive and shut the computer off by holding the power button, then press it again to restart. And that should make the computer boot back to the BIOS. And here in the BIOS, I will click on Advanced Mode, then click Advanced here at the top, and then click PCH FW Configuration, And on this TPM device selection, you want to make sure that enable firmware TPM is set. Now my computer was already set this way, but if yours is not, make this change. Then I'm going to click on boot and secure boot. And then on OS type, I want to check Windows UEFI mode. Now there could be other settings that you'll need to adjust depending on your situation. And if this does not help, search on Google for "this PC can't run Windows" and then add your motherboard brand or even the model number. And hopefully someone else has already found the settings you will need to change. And now I just need to click exit. And before you do anything else, be sure to put the USB drive back into the computer because we're going to reboot here in just a second. And we want to make sure that this boots back into the Windows installation on the USB drive. All right, so now I'm going to click Save Changes and Reset and click OK. And we should be rebooting now, and this should bring up Windows and we can resume where we were before. And that looks good so far. We're definitely booting back into the Windows installation. And here we are again, and we can walk through the different steps that we did before. We'll have to do those again. And if these changes fix the problem, you will not see "this PC can't run Windows" this time. All right, so let me go back through these again. I'll click Next, click Install Now. And again, I don't have a product key at this time. I could enter that later. And again, I'll choose Windows 11 Pro. And this is where we had our problem last time. And look at that, we made it past the point where we could not install Windows the last time. So it looks like that was our problem solved. And so now we just need to get our lawyers again to read the agreement and agree to that. And we will click Next. And we're not upgrading, we're actually doing a custom install. So click on Custom. And on this screen, you would see if you had multiple drives that you had installed into the computer, you would see the different drives. I only have the one NVMe drive, but if you had multiple drives, you need to make sure you know which drive it is that you want to install Windows on. Easy selection for me, and I'm going to click Next. And so now it's copying files from the USB drive onto the NVMe drive so that it can actually do the installation from that. And this part should go pretty quickly. And note here that it does tell you your computer will restart several times. This might take a while, so be prepared for multiple reboots in this process. All right, and it's going to restart here. I'm going to go ahead and pull this USB drive out because it's no longer needed. And Windows will restart itself. And once again, it's rebooting now. It looks like it is starting Windows this time. And there's another restart. It's always just a moment, right? All right, so here we go. I'm in the United States, so I'll click on Yes. Pick your country, of course. And yes, that's the keyboard I want to use. And skip that. If your computer is not connected to the internet, you may get to a place where you can't move forward in the installation process, like where we are now. Now, Microsoft wants you to log into your Microsoft account, if you even have one, and connect this installation of Windows to your account. Now, if you're okay with that, go ahead and connect your computer to a network with an Ethernet cable. But if you prefer not to connect this computer to your Microsoft account, here's a way to keep the installation going without having to sign into Microsoft. So first, press the Shift key and hit F10. And that will open a window that gives you an old school command prompt. If you remember the DOS days, this might look familiar, but if not, don't worry. Just in here type 00, okay, and so it's not typing. If I try to type, I'm getting nothing. One thing you might need to do is just click on that window, and because for some reason the focus was not on that window. So now if I type OOBE, there we go, that fixed that problem. /bypass NRO. And note that these are the letter O, not the number 0. And now I'll just hit enter, and that's going to reboot the computer. And the computer should reboot, and this time the install should allow you to proceed without having to log into your Microsoft account. Now I do have to go back through the same steps, so I'm saying United States there, US, skip adding the second keyboard. And this time when we get to the screen prompting for an Ethernet connection, there is an option here that says I don't have internet. So I'll click on that. Then I'm going to click continue with limited setup. And so now I'm going to give the computer a name. Let's just call it Nerd Sidekick. Name it whatever you want. Click next. Give it a password. Yes, this is important, and make sure to remember it or write it down somewhere. And click next. And you'll have to enter that again. And now you're going to add your security questions. What was your first pet's name? What's the name of your city, etc. So I'm going to fill these out and won't bore you with that. All right, so now it's time to make some privacy choices or settings here. And you can just read these and make your selections according to taste. And if you don't like feeling that Big Brother is watching you, you probably want to turn most of these off, but that's up to you. So I'm going to turn off location. Find my device might be useful, especially if this is a portable device like a laptop. So I'm going to leave that on even though this is a desktop computer. The rest of these I'm going to just turn off. And I click accept. We're almost there. And here we are in Windows. Now you would think since you just used the media creation tool to download Windows to your USB drive for the installation, that it would have all the latest and greatest files and that Windows would be completely up to date. That would make sense, which is precisely why it is not true. So the first thing to do is connect your computer to an internet connection if you don't already have one. And if you're connecting through Wi-Fi, you will need to connect to your network. There are lots of tutorials on that, so I assume that you can get your computer connected. Now you may need to connect a Wi-Fi antenna like this one that came with the motherboard. If you haven't already done that, go ahead and do that. So I'm going to plug in an Ethernet cable and get this connected to my router and then get this onto the internet. I've got my Ethernet cable. I'm going to plug that into the back of the computer. And you can see right away this got a connection. And this is going to ask some things probably in your computer that may come up already. It's asking if I want to make some updates. This is an ASUS connection here that I don't want, so I'm just going to click on no. So now I can start downloading the Windows updates, and the quickest way to get to that is just to come in here and type Windows, and right away you can see it says check for updates. I'll click on that, and on this page I will check for updates. And you can see there's a bunch of updates that are going to get downloaded both for Windows as well as looks like maybe some drivers for some of the hardware in the computer. And you can see some of them are downloading pretty quickly, but some of these are pretty sizable and it could take a good bit of time for these to download. Your computer will probably need to boot a time or two, or 5 or 10, and some of these updates are, like I said, they're pretty large, so they could take a good while to download, so just be patient. And so you can see one of the things that's happening already is you can see some of these have failed. You can see that we can't install it because other updates are in progress. So that's a common thing, is you're going to find that there's maybe some incompatibilities or issues with, you have to do some of these installations before the others will work. And so once the others complete, then we can retry some of these. Sometime before the year is out, this should complete. All good things are worth waiting for. That's what I keep telling myself. Back in the old days, installing Windows was just a stack of disks that you had to put in one after another. All right, so we've installed a bunch of these. The ones that say retry, I'm just going to leave those for now. It is wanting to restart to install a couple of these major updates. So I'm going to go ahead and click restart now. All right, we're rebooting. And we're going to start over, restart again. All right. And now I got to put in my password. And I just want to go back to check for updates. And let's see what else. Obviously it's telling you that it encountered some errors. And so we're going to retry all. It's going to check for some additional updates. There should be some more. Once your computer reboots, you should go back to the Windows Updates page and just click check for updates again, and do this until all the updates are installed. Now you can do other things on your computer while these updates are downloading and installing. I'd recommend that you open Microsoft's Edge web browser, and that comes installed with Windows. If you like that web browser, then you're good to go. But if you prefer Google's Chrome browser or Firefox or something else, you can go ahead and get those through the Edge browser. Microsoft's always trying to get you to sign into something. I'm just going to say start without your data. I'm going to uncheck this and confirm and start browsing. And of course they want you to customize something, but you know what, let's just go to Google Chrome, and we're going to download now. And so I downloaded that, so I need to click on Chrome Setup and just go ahead and run the browser setup for Chrome. And you could sign in now if you had a Google account. I'll just say no, don't sign in for the moment. And if you want to set Chrome as your default browser, you can do that. And right here, just make Google Chrome your default browser, set default. And there we are in Chrome. All right, so I'm going back to check for updates. Let's see where things are. This is still working, installing this last update. And so this completed. I'm going to restart this. And another restart. And I'm going to try one more time. Let's see if there's any additional updates available. And finally, you can see it says that I am up to date. So that took a while, but we finished. And part of what may get downloaded during this update process are drivers that make your specific hardware in your computer work. But often the drivers that Microsoft sends your way during this update process are not the most up-to-date drivers. So after you finish the Microsoft Windows update process, you need to spend some time downloading some of the more important drivers directly from the source. For example, your graphics card has software that gets updated regularly, So whatever driver the Windows Update grabbed for you may not be the most recent. If you installed an NVIDIA-based GPU, you should go to nvidia.com. So I'll go to nvidia.com. And then just click on drivers here. And then you can put in your product type, series, the different products, the operating system, etc., and search, and that will help you find the drivers for your NVIDIA GPU. And if you installed an AMD Radeon GPU, you should go to amd.com and click on Resources and Support. And then over here under Radeon Graphics and AMD Chipsets, click on Drivers. And then you can scroll down here and browse products. So it would be under Graphics. And then you can just choose the product family and continue drilling down and find the exact graphics card that you have. And then that will allow you to download and install the driver for your particular graphics card. And then next you want to make sure the drivers related to your motherboard are up to date. Now you saw me download the BIOS update for this motherboard earlier. And I can go back to the motherboard support page. So if I just put in Google here, ASUS Prime Z790P Wi-Fi, that's it. And I think I'd added BIOS to the term. Hit enter. And let's click on this. That's probably where we need to be. And that's the page where that's the 1656 BIOS. So the other thing you want to look at are the driver and tools and see what kind of drivers are available in here. So what got installed during the Windows Update process is almost certainly sufficient for your computer to work, but you should look through these and just download any that seem like they are very recent, and you may not have received those recent drivers in the Windows Update process. The chipset driver is probably the most important here, right here. So consider downloading and installing that. If you're having problems getting your internet working on this computer, then well, first of all, you're probably on a different computer browsing the internet, not this one, but you need to find another working computer and download the LAN driver and the Wi-Fi driver for your motherboard, and then just copy those over with a USB driver or USB drive and just install them on the new computer. Now, I would consider bookmarking this page here. On Chrome, you can just click on that, and so now it'd be easy to come back to this page and check for additional updates in the future. Now, while the Windows update that I was doing to get the latest and greatest updates will most of the time keep your drivers up to date, BIOS updates aren't always available or even advisable to do through Windows Update. It is possible to do BIOS updates through Windows updates, but that's not something that it gets done a lot, and there's some settings that may have to be turned on your motherboard. So really, you may want to just periodically check for any BIOS updates by going back to this page and then install those as needed. So you may find that something doesn't function in the future if you install some newer RAM or something like that. But more than likely, if you're functioning at this point, you're probably going to be okay. There may be some updates that come out on your BIOS later, but that should be it in terms of the software that you need to download and install at this point. Whew. So we are almost done. Now, just a couple of more steps. Now, if you have your Windows activation key, you can enter that just by typing in the search box. Start typing the word activation, and you'll see activation settings comes up, and you can just click here, or you can click over here on open. And right here where it says change product key, I'm going to click on change. And here is where you would enter your 25-digit, 25-character key. And I do have one that I have already purchased. And this may be from a box that you have purchased, or if you have gotten one by email. If you've got it in an email, you can just copy and paste it. Otherwise, you can type it here. And so I've got mine, and I will click next. And you can read the license terms if you want, but otherwise you can just click activate. And that's it for activating Windows. Next, remember we talked about XMP or Extreme Memory Profile in your BIOS settings. Now that BIOS is updated and Windows is installed, I want to turn on XMP so I get the best speed I can out of my RAM. So we need to get back into BIOS. Now, there are a couple of ways to do that. I've talked about this a little bit before, but you can always restart your computer and press F2 or the delete key or whatever key will trigger your particular BIOS. But sometimes your computer may boot so fast that you can't easily get BIOS to open. So if that happens to you, here's a way to avoid that problem. The easiest way to do that is to do a shift restart. Now what I mean by that is you will come down here and click on the Windows button or the Start button. And if you come over here and click on the Power button, and then I'm going to hold down the Shift key on my keyboard, and then I'm going to press the Restart button. And you can see when you first start the computer, it looks a little different. It says please wait, and if that works, your computer should restart, but it will restart into this advanced startup options menu. And so now what you want to do is click on troubleshoot and then advanced options, and then over here, there you go, is what we want is the UEFI firmware settings. So I'm going to click that. If you're not happy with that, you can always go back. You can go back through all of these, but again, I'm going to click advanced options, UEFI firmware settings, and then basically my only path forward is to click restart. And if everything goes well, we should, instead of booting into Windows, you should immediately see your BIOS open up like we've seen in the past when we've worked on it. And there you go. We booted right into BIOS, and I can make the changes that I want to make. Now I'm back in Windows again, and if for some reason holding down Shift while restarting does not work, you can always come down here and click on Start, and then find Settings, and then go to Windows Update, and then click on Advanced Options and Recovery, and then Advanced Startup, the Advanced Startup line here. If you just click on Restart Now and click Restart, and that should give you the same result that we got the other way, but if for some reason that the Shift Restart did not work, then this way should definitely work for you. And we should see the please wait notice. There it is. And now we'll boot into the advanced setup options menu. Again, I can click troubleshoot, advanced options, UEFI firmware settings, and then restart. Okay, so now that we are in the BIOS again, let's update the XMP settings. Now, right now you can see XMP here is disabled. So just click that, click enabled, and then now here you should see the settings that are correct for your RAM. And once this is activated, your RAM should run faster. It should run at the speeds that it's actually rated for. And now you should immediately save and exit so that just this one change that we've made gets saved and implemented. So I could click down here on save and exit, or I can just hit the F10 key, and you can see the list of changes that got made in the background just by activating the XMP settings, and it's asking if I want to confirm to make those changes, and I'm going to say OK. It may take a little extra time for your motherboard to make some adjustments for the new RAM speed, and then it's going to reboot. So just don't panic if it takes a little longer than normal for your computer to reboot. All right, so now I'm going to press delete to get back into the BIOS, and I caught it in time, and that was good. So now you can see the changes here are definitely enabled, although when you look at the speed here, you don't necessarily see it. But if I go into advanced mode, and you can see the memory is actually reflecting the change, the 6,000 megahertz speed, which is the rated speed for those particular sticks of RAM. All right, so I'm going to shut down, and it's time to reinstall the glass doors. Yes, I am old school, even though I don't have a physical spinning hard drive in this computer. I'm going to shut down just to show you the best practices. Now, this isn't critical, but if you have a hard drive, I always encourage shutting down to make big physical changes to a computer. In my past, I have damaged spinning drives by making physical changes to a computer while it was still on. Hard drives have gotten a lot better, so they're less likely to be damaged by physical bumps, but why take the chance? So I've got the computer off, and now I can put the glass doors back on. And one final touch, I'll add a Nerd Sidekick sticker to the door. Well, guess what? You have built your first computer, or maybe it's your 10th. But congratulations, it really is a huge accomplishment that you should be proud of. I know that that took some time. I hope it was worth your time. I hope it was helpful and that you now have a greater understanding of how to build a PC. And if it helped, I always appreciate a like and a subscribe. That way you'll get more tech content like this in the future. I'm Fred Kelly, your Nerd Sidekick. Thank you so much for watching.